The Winter He Couldn't Forget, written by Violet Sinclair, narrated by Isadora Blythe. Chapter 1. London, December 1818. Rain slicked the cobblestones of Bond Street and turned the wind into a whip. Gabriel Sterling drew his collar higher and pressed forward through the crush of umbrellas, hat plumes, and parcels. The air smelled of wet wool, roasted chestnuts, and horse dung, London's own perfume at Christmastide. A coachman shouted at a dray blocking the lane. A lady shrieked as muddy water splashed her hem. The city, in all its splendor, was at war with itself, half of it chasing pleasure, the other half elbowing through misery. Gabriel preferred misery. It was familiar, predictable. He had endured 29 Christmases at Wrentham Park, each one a riot of overfed relatives and forced cheer. His sisters wept at every toast, his brothers roared with brandy-soaked joy, the children shrieked and fought over toys. Even the dogs wore ribbons. His mother called it tradition. He called it purgatory. This year, he had escaped it all. No hearthside sing-alongs, no midnight sermons about gratitude. He'd sent the gifts, the letters, and his regrets, and stayed in town. He intended to pass Christmas Day in perfect solitude, a fire in the grate, a bottle of port, perhaps an afternoon visit to his mistress if the mood suited him. She was reliable company, warm, quiet, undemanding. Everything his family was not. He should have felt relief, freedom. Instead, there was only that restless hollowness that no fire, no port, no woman had ever quite warmed. The feeling had been with him since his father's death a decade ago, since the title had settled on his shoulders like a yoke, duty without joy, obligation without meaning. He'd learned early that love and duty were often the same thing, only one demanded you smile while it suffocated you. A carol caught on the wind. He might have ignored it had it not cut through the city's noise with startling clarity. Lully, Lulla, thou little tiny child. The voice was pure enough to stop him where he stood. It wasn't the reedy shriek of street singers he'd expected. This was finer, fragile yet sure, like glass held to a flame. He turned toward the sound. A cluster of carolers stood beneath the gaslight at the corner. Their clothes were threadbare, their cheeks flushed from cold. But the song didn't come from them. It came from a young woman standing slightly apart, a child no more than 4 clasping her gloved hand. Her hood had slipped back, revealing hair the color of chestnuts dampened by the mist. Her eyes were lowered to the child, but her voice soared upward, clear as a bell in the night air. Passers-by slowed, drawn despite themselves. Even Gabriel felt something shift beneath his ribs, a quiet he hadn't known he was missing. Perhaps that was what unsettled him most. The way her song reminded him that Christmas was meant for those who still believed in hope, for those who hadn't yet learned that joy was a child's game, played before the world taught you better. When the final note faded, the street seemed to exhale. Then came the jingle of coins, someone tossing a few into the little boy's wooden bowl. Gabriel found himself moving forward before he quite knew why. The woman looked up then, meeting his gaze. For the briefest moment, the noise of London vanished. She smiled, not in invitation but in simple gratitude, and Gabriel, cold, rational Gabriel, felt absurdly winded, as if he'd been struck in the chest by the echo of her song. He touched the brim of his hat in acknowledgement, the gesture automatic, and for the first time in years he wondered what, precisely, he was doing with his life. Meg Winslow pressed her gloved hands around Lottie's smaller fingers, trying to keep them both warm. The wind funneled through Bond Street like a blade, slicing through her heavy cloak. The bonnet brim shielded her from the worst of the drizzle, but her cheeks burned with cold and embarrassment. She stood too close to the carolers, and the passers-by likely assumed she belonged among them. It wasn't that she begrudged the singers. They were kind people from the church she and the children had joined after moving to London in the summer. Their cause was a worthy one, funds for roof repairs, but 27 years of singing together had not improved their sense of pitch. Meg would have laughed if her teeth weren't chattering. She hadn't planned to be here. She'd been drawn into it by the vicar's enthusiasm when Theo, her son, her pride, had been heard humming during a hymn one Sunday. His clear, bell-like voice had silenced the entire congregation. By the end of the service, he'd been drafted into the carol group, and there had been no escaping the invitation. Theo had glowed with excitement. Meg less so. 4 years ago, she would have laughed at the idea of standing on Bond Street singing for coins. 4 years ago, she'd been Mrs. Robert Winslow, wife of a gentleman of modest means, mistress of a small but respectable home in Hampshire. Her father, a baronet's younger son, had secured her one London season when she was 18. She'd attended the balls, worn the gowns, and learned what it meant to want something she could never have. Gabriel Sterling had been 19 that season, newly an earl, and utterly unaware of her existence. She'd watched him from ballroom edges, memorized the line of his shoulders, the way he moved through crowds as if he owned the very air. Once they'd danced, a country set where he'd smiled politely and forgotten her before the music ended. She'd married Robert 2 years later, convinced herself it was love. He'd been kind. It should have been enough. Then consumption had taken him, slowly, expensively. The medical bills had consumed what little they had. Robert's family had made it clear she was no longer their concern. Her own father had died the following year, leaving everything to her brother, who had his own family to feed. 6 months ago, Robert's brother William had offered her a place in his London household, an offer made from duty, not affection. She'd accepted because she had 2 children and no choices left. Now she lived in the margins of William's home, trying to be useful enough to justify the space she occupied, invisible enough not to be a burden. Now she stood on the slick pavement, pretending she didn't care about the stares of fashionable strangers who hurried past the small group. She wanted to be anywhere but here. Yet her heart swelled when Theo stepped forward, clutching his hymn book with mittened hands. He began his solo, his voice threading pure and true through the drizzle and noise. Meg forgot to breathe. Every note shimmered like light against the gray day. Pride warmed her chest, followed swiftly by worry. What if no one stopped? What if the world simply hurried by and didn't hear him? She looked down at Lottie. Her daughter was bundled to the chin, eyes wide with wonder, the soft curls at her temples damp with mist. "Hold tight, my love," Meg whispered, though the child was already pressing close against her side. From the corner of her eye, she noticed movement. A tall gentleman had stopped a few yards away. He leaned lightly on a silver-topped cane, his posture unhurried but commanding, as if Bond Street itself existed for his convenience. His greatcoat gleamed dark against the lamplight, and his hat sat at a perfect angle. He looked like he'd stepped out of a painting. Something about the line of his jaw, the tilt of his shoulders, stirred a faint memory. Recognition came with a flutter of disbelief. Gabriel Sterling, the Earl of Wrentham, once the subject of gossip whispered behind fans, once the man she'd watched from across ballrooms and told herself she'd forgotten. It unsettled her, now, to discover that some dreams had only gone quiet, not died. He was listening to Theo. Meg's breath caught. Her son's voice rose in its final refrain, the sweetness piercing the cold like sunlight through frost. When the last note faded, a hush seemed to fall over the street. Then, a single clink, coin meeting wood, as the gentleman tossed a contribution into the little collection bowl. Her gaze followed the motion, and when she looked up again, his eyes were on hers. It was the briefest moment, a heartbeat suspended in the damp winter air. No recognition flickered there. How could there be? But something softer lingered, a quiet acknowledgement that left her chest aching. He touched the brim of his hat, polite, distant. Yet for a moment, Meg felt seen. Not as the widow of a man long dead, nor as the woman living on her brother-in-law's grudging charity. Simply seen. And then he moved on, his steps measured and sure, swallowed by the crowd. She turned back to Theo, whose face was flushed with the glow of applause from a few latecomers who had paused to listen. She bent and kissed the top of his cap. "Beautifully done, my darling." He beamed at her. Lottie giggled, the sound bright as a bell. Meg smiled, though her heart felt full to breaking. For years, Christmas had been a season she endured. Too much noise, too many empty gestures. Robert had never cared for it, and after his death, the holidays had become something to survive for the children's sake. Yet standing here, cold and humbled and oddly hopeful, she felt the faintest spark of what she'd thought lost. Perhaps this year might be different. Perhaps, if she dared to believe in it, Christmas could mean more than the ache of memory. Perhaps it could still hold the promise of something new. Gabriel had intended to walk straight on, to leave the music and the strange ache it had stirred behind him. Yet he hesitated at the corner, unable to shake the sound of the boy's voice. The melody lingered, soft and haunting, threading through the rhythm of carriage wheels and rain. A flash of movement caught his eye, something small and blue rolling across the wet cobblestones. A child's mitten, sodden and forlorn. It came to rest against his boot. Before he could bend to retrieve it, a small figure darted forward. The little girl from the caroling, the one who'd stood clutching her mother's hand, dropped to her knees at his feet, reaching for the mitten with single-minded determination. Her bonnet slipped sideways as she grabbed not the mitten, but the hem of his greatcoat for balance, using it to pull herself upright. She beamed up at him with complete, guileless delight, the rescued mitten clutched in one damp fist. Gabriel froze. Children, in his experience, were noisy, unpredictable creatures best avoided. He had long perfected the art of keeping his nieces and nephews at arm's length, by glare alone when necessary. Yet this one blinked up at him, unbothered, her smile wide and fearless. "Lottie," a woman's voice called, breathless and anxious. The child turned, still holding tight to his coat. The woman approached quickly, her skirts brushing damp against the cobblestones. When she reached them, she dropped to her knees, gathering the child close. "What did I tell you about wandering, my love? You cannot simply—" She looked up then, her words faltering. It was the singer, the boy's mother, the woman from the carolers. Gabriel inclined his head slightly. "There's no harm done." Her cheeks were flushed from cold and embarrassment. "I do beg your pardon, my lord," she said softly, her gaze fixed on her daughter's bonnet ribbons as she retied them with shaking fingers. "I promise it will not happen again." It seems she meant no mischief. Gabriel's tone was gentler than he intended. He studied the child, then the mother. The boy had rejoined them now, standing close to his mother's side, his eyes wide and uncertain. Gabriel found himself speaking before he'd thought it through. "Your son's voice is remarkable. I've seldom heard its equal." She dipped into a quick curtsy, still holding Lottie's hand. "You are very kind, my lord." Kind. The word did not suit him. Still, he found himself continuing. The words surprised him, even as he spoke them. He'd written to his mother only yesterday, declining to host the annual musicale. Too much bother, he'd claimed. Too many expectations. Yet here he was, issuing invitations to a woman whose name he didn't even know. "I host a private concert at my home each December," he said, the impulse rising before he could check it. "An evening for those who appreciate music, not mere noise. I would be honored if your son would sing for us." Her spine straightened, a subtle shift that spoke of pride. "My son is not a performer for hire, my lord," she said evenly. "He sings for joy, not for display." The words were calm, but her tone carried a rebuke that landed with surprising force. Gabriel's mouth tightened. She thought he was offering charity, or worse, patronage, as if the boy were some curiosity to be trotted out for his guests' amusement. "Of course," he said, his voice cooler now. "Forgive my presumption. I meant only that his gift deserves to be heard." "Then you have heard it," she said, gathering Lottie close and glancing toward the carolers who were preparing to move on. She took her son's hand. "Good day, my lord." She turned to leave, the boy looking back over his shoulder with wide, curious eyes. Within moments, she had gathered both children and stepped into the crowd, their small figures soon swallowed by the gray swirl of shoppers and mist. Gabriel stood where she left him, the rain prickling his hat brim. He should have been offended. Few dared speak to him with such unvarnished dismissal, but offense was not what he felt. What lingered instead was the echo of the boy's voice and the memory of the woman's eyes, steady, proud, and far warmer than the city deserved. He'd been foolish to speak to her at all. Foolish, and yet he couldn't quite regret it. The sound of that song would not leave him, nor would the look she'd given him, one that made him feel absurdly as if he were not the Earl of Wrentham, but a man who'd forgotten what it meant to be truly seen. He adjusted his gloves and turned back toward Brook Street, his pace brisk. He had no business lingering in the cold, no business thinking about a widow and her children. His Christmas would be as he'd planned it, solitary, controlled, free of entanglements. Yet as he walked, he found himself listening for music that was no longer there, and wondering, despite himself, if perhaps he'd been wrong about what he wanted after all. Chapter 2. The memory of Bond Street clung to Meg like damp wool. She'd lain awake half the night, replaying the encounter in her mind, the moment when the Earl had looked at her son, at her, with something that had felt too much like admiration. Arrogant man. How dare he speak to her in the middle of the street, as if they were equals? And yet, how foolish of her to have felt breathless when his eyes met hers. She'd risen early, dressed in the gray morning light, and descended to find the breakfast room mercifully empty. William and his wife had already left for morning calls, a relief. She poured herself tea with hands that trembled only slightly, and tried not to think about silver-topped canes or the tilt of a man's smile in lamplight. The children arrived moments later. Lottie bounced into her chair, chattering about the doll she'd named Princess Pudding. Theo slid into his seat without a word, his gaze fixed on his plate. "Did you sleep well, my love?" Meg asked, reaching across to smooth his hair. He shrugged, pushing his eggs about with a fork. "Yes, Mama." "Theo sang beautifully yesterday," Lottie announced, oblivious to her brother's mood. "Everyone said so. The tall man with the cane gave us money." "Lottie," Meg said gently, "eat your bread, please." Her daughter obeyed, humming tunelessly through a mouthful of toast. Theo remained silent, his small shoulders hunched in a way that made Meg's chest ache. "You did sing beautifully," she said quietly. "I was very proud of you." He looked up then, his eyes too serious for 8 years old. "But I can't sing at the concert." "No, darling, you can't." "Because the Earl is bad?" "No." She set down her cup, choosing her words carefully. "Because the Earl doesn't understand that your voice is a gift, not a thing to be displayed." Theo considered this, his brow furrowing. "Miss Kemp says gifts are meant to be shared." "Miss Kemp is right, but they should be shared freely, not because someone important asks for them." He absorbed this in silence, then returned to his breakfast. But the set of his mouth told her he didn't quite believe her. She'd disappointed him. Worse, she'd let pride overrule what might have been a moment of joy for him. The guilt sat heavy in her stomach, souring even the weak tea. She had refused an invitation that might have brought her son happiness. She had deprived her children of the little excitement the season offered. And why? Because 10 years ago, Gabriel Sterling had danced with her once and forgotten her before the music ended. Because seeing him again had reminded her of all the foolish dreams she'd once harbored. When she was 18, his name had made her heart flutter. He danced once with her friend Clara Dryden, and Meg had envied her so fiercely she'd gone home in tears. She'd outgrown all that, of course. She had married Robert Winslow instead, good-natured, safe, and kind. She'd convinced herself it was love. And now Robert was gone, and she was left with children, debts, and an inconvenient tendency to remember the tilt of an earl's smile. She'd grown up, married, learned caution, and yet the old ache had recognized him first. "Mama?" Lottie's voice broke through her thoughts. "Are you sad?" Meg forced a smile. "No, my love, just thinking." "About the tall man?" "Lottie, finish your toast." By the time the breakfast things were cleared, Meg had resolved to take the children to the lending library. They needed something cheerful, something that did not involve music or men who thought they could command obedience with a well-placed word. She was halfway up the stairs when the knock came, firm, official, echoing through William's too-quiet house. Meg froze on the landing. Sutton, William's butler, moved toward the door with his usual measured pace. Meg told herself it was nothing, a tradesman perhaps, or one of William's associates. But something cold and certain settled in her stomach. "Reverend Baker to see Mrs. Winslow," Sutton announced, his voice carrying up the stairs, "and the Earl of Wrentham." The floor seemed to tilt beneath her feet. She descended slowly, gripping the banister harder than necessary. William and his wife were out, thank God for small mercies. She would not have to endure this humiliation before witnesses. When she entered William's parlor, Reverend Baker was already beaming, his hands clasped as if in benediction. Beside him stood the man she had spent half the night trying to forget. Gabriel Sterling, immaculate as ever, his many-caped greatcoat still dusted with frost. He stood near the window, the winter light catching the planes of his face, and for a moment Meg forgot to breathe. "Mrs. Winslow," The vicar rushed forward, seizing her hand with both of his. What a blessing this morning brings, such generosity, such an opportunity. Meg's gaze slid past him to Gabriel. The Earl inclined his head, his expression composed, almost indifferent. But something flickered in his eyes. Expectation, perhaps, or quiet amusement that made her spine stiffen. Reverend Baker, she said carefully. My lord, this is unexpected. Forgive the intrusion, Gabriel said, his voice as smooth as she remembered. I came to speak with Reverend Baker about the church's fundraising efforts. When I learned you resided here, I thought it only courteous to call. Liar. She could see it in the slight curve of his mouth, the way he watched her. His lordship has made the most generous offer, Reverend Baker continued, practically vibrating with excitement. He has agreed to host our little choir at his annual Christmas concert on the evening of December 23rd, just 2 days before Christmas itself. Can you imagine? Our carolers performing before London's finest patrons, and at such a blessing. The trap closed around her with perfect precision. How generous, Meg said, her voice carefully neutral. He was most taken with our performance on Bond Street, the vicar went on, especially young Theo's solo. His lordship has specifically requested that your son sing again at the concert. Such an honor, Mrs. Winslow. Quite an opportunity for the boy. Meg forced herself to meet Gabriel's gaze. He stood perfectly still, waiting. Not gloating, that would have been easier to bear, just waiting. As if he knew precisely what she would say and was curious to see if she'd surprise him. My son, she said slowly, is not a performer for hire, my lord. No. Gabriel stepped forward, his tone gentle but firm. He is an artist. There is a difference. I would not insult him with payment, Mrs. Winslow, but I should be honored to provide him a proper audience. The finest musicians in London will be present, people who would appreciate his gift as it deserves. The words were gracious, the delivery was flawless, and beneath it all, she heard the unspoken command, I have made this impossible for you to refuse. Such thoughtfulness, Reverend Baker exclaimed, and so generous, not only the concert, but a donation of £50 to our fund. £50, Mrs. Winslow. We shall have our new roof and funds remaining for the choir's music. £50. More than most families saw in a year, more than Meg had to her name. The vicar's eager enthusiasm only drew the noose tighter. She could hardly refuse her vicar, her church, and her son all at once. I see. Her hands curled into the folds of her skirt, hidden in the drape of gray wool. You are very persuasive, my lord. Not persuasive, he replied softly, merely determined. The vicar, oblivious to the frost between them, rushed on. I've already arranged for Miss Kemp to call this afternoon to discuss the program. His lordship would like Theo to rehearse in the music room beforehand, to accustom himself to the acoustics, you understand. Such consideration. Meg's jaw ached from holding her expression neutral. There is little to discuss. He will sing what his lordship heard on Bond Street. As you wish. Gabriel's lips curved slightly, but I look forward to hearing it again. He said it quietly without emphasis, but something in his tone made her pulse stumble, as if he were saying, I look forward to seeing you again, as if this were about more than a boy's voice in a church's roof. Meg curtsied, the motion automatic. Reverend Baker, please thank his lordship for his generosity. We shall, of course, attend. The vicar beamed. Splendid, a triumph for us all. Oh, what a Christmas this shall be. When she finally saw them to the door, she remained perfectly polite. Gabriel paused on the threshold, his gaze holding hers for a moment longer than propriety allowed. Until the concert, Mrs. Winslow, he said. My lord. She curtsied again, lower this time, and closed the door the instant he turned away. Only then did she press a trembling hand to her temple and lean against the door frame. He had tricked her. Not cruelly, perhaps, but thoroughly. And the worst of it, the most humiliating part, was that a small, treacherous corner of her heart was already wondering what it would be like to see him again. Upstairs, she heard Lottie's laughter, bright and oblivious. Theo would be pleased when she told him. She should feel relief, victory even. Her son would have his moment. Instead, she felt as if she'd just stepped onto a stage with no script and no idea how the play would end. Christmas, it seemed, had conspired against her. Gabriel settled back against the carriage seat as it pulled away from the modest townhouse in Bloomsbury. Reverend Baker sat across from him, still effusing gratitude, but Gabriel barely heard him. He'd gone to considerable trouble to arrange this morning's visit. After leaving Bond Street 2 days ago, he'd found himself unable to shake the memory of the boy's voice or the mother's eyes. He'd told himself it was merely aesthetic appreciation. The child had talent. Someone should nurture it. But that didn't explain why he'd spent the better part of yesterday tracking down Reverend Baker, or why he'd penned a letter to his mother informing her he would host the annual musicale after all, or why he'd personally called on the vicar this morning with an offer of £50 and a performance venue, merely determined, he'd told her. More honest would have been utterly irrational. He'd expected her to be grateful, relieved, perhaps. Instead, she'd looked at him as if he'd cornered her, which he supposed he had. The vicar's enthusiasm had been his weapon, and he'd wielded it with calculated precision. He should feel satisfaction at having maneuvered her into acceptance. Instead, he felt vaguely unsettled. She'd been different this morning. Not the proud, defensive woman from Bond Street, but something more fragile beneath the composure. He'd seen it in the way her hands had tightened in her skirts, the careful neutrality of her voice. She'd agreed because she had no choice, and she resented him for it. He should not care. He barely knew her. A widow with 2 children and a voice that had stopped him on a snowy street, that was all she was, all she should be. Such a lovely family, Reverend Baker was saying. Poor Mrs. Winslow has had a difficult few years, I understand. Her husband passed, you know. She lives now with his brother. Very charitable of Mr. Winslow to take her in. The children are well behaved, of course, but one senses the strain. I'm sure your kindness will mean a great deal to them, my lord. Gabriel made a non-committal sound. Charity. Is that what the vicar thought this was? He wasn't certain what it was. He only knew that when she'd looked at him this morning, really looked at him with those steady, knowing eyes, he'd felt seen in a way that had nothing to do with his title or his wealth, as if she saw past the Earl to the man who'd been standing alone in the rain, listening to music that made him ache for something he couldn't name. The concert is in 1 week, Reverend Baker said. Plenty of time for preparations. I do hope, that is, I trust Mrs. Winslow will not be too inconvenienced by the rehearsals. I shall ensure she is not, Gabriel said. And he would. He'd planned this carefully. The rehearsal, the concert, the donation. He'd created reasons for her to see him again, to spend time in his home. He'd told himself it was for the boy's sake. But as the carriage rolled through the gray streets, he could no longer pretend he believed his own excuses. He wanted to see her again. Wanted to understand why a widow who lived on charity and sang for coins could make him question every choice he'd made. Wanted to know if she remembered him from somewhere. There had been something in her eyes yesterday, a flicker of recognition he couldn't place. The snow was falling again, soft and silent. London looked almost clean beneath it, almost new. Gabriel leaned his head back and allowed himself a small, private smile. 1 week until the concert. 1 week to unravel the mystery of Mrs. Winslow and her remarkable son. 1 week to discover why, for the first time in a decade, Christmas felt like something other than an obligation to be endured. Chapter 3. 3 days had passed since the vicar's visit, and the scent of pine and wax polish now filled Gabriel's hall. He stood in the doorway of his music room, watching his housekeeper direct the maids in their final preparations. Garlands looped over every banister, the sconces gleamed like captured stars, and the floors shone with fresh polish. He had told himself it was for the sake of his guests, that this year's concert fell close enough to Christmas to warrant a little cheer. But the sight of holly berries against white plaster only reminded him how determined he'd been to avoid the holiday altogether. He had planned to remain in London precisely to escape the laughter, the games, and the endless noise of family gatherings. Yet here he was, standing in a house that smelled like Christmas morning and anticipating the arrival of a widow and her children with an eagerness that bordered on absurd. His mood soured with the realization. Mrs. Trent approached, her capable hands smoothing her apron. "Shall I have the footman bring mistletoe for the doorways, my lord? It's traditional for—" "No mistletoe," he said curtly. "None anywhere." She blinked, clearly taken aback. "As you wish, my lord." The very thought made him uneasy. If he kissed Mrs. Winslow, and God help him, the thought had crossed his mind more than once, it would not be because of a sprig of greenery and tradition's flimsy excuse. It would be because he chose to, because she let him. Mrs. Winslow. The name alone was enough to tighten something in his chest. He had not gone to see Lucy the previous night as planned. He'd intended to, had even called for his carriage, but at the last moment had changed the direction, instructing his coachman to drive aimlessly through the fog instead. The silence had been unbearable, his thoughts full of a boy's song and a woman's eyes that lingered long after she'd turned away. He'd ended the night at his club, where the air smelled of smoke and brandy, and the only conversation came from cards shuffling on felt. Now daylight brought no peace. He told himself his irritation came from poor sleep, from the servants bustling, from the endless lists of arrangements, but deep down he knew better. He was thinking about her. Again. Still. He had gone too far in securing the choir. It had been rash to press the vicar, though it had seemed practical at the time. The boy's voice deserved an audience, and Gabriel's concert would provide it. Still, he could admit, if only to himself, that his insistence had been more than artistic zeal. He wanted to see her again, to know whether the spark he'd imagined in her eyes had been defiance or something else, to discover if proximity would cure this strange fascination or only deepen it. He walked through the music room, his boots echoing on the polished floor. The pianoforte had been tuned, the chairs arranged for the small orchestra. The modest stage gleamed in the pale winter light. The acoustics were exquisite. He had designed them himself years ago, when music had still mattered to him for reasons beyond duty. Normally, the sight of order and readiness pleased him. Today, it made him restless. He imagined the room later, the hush as the child's clear voice lifted through the candlelit space, the mother's quiet pride, the guests caught by surprise. He imagined her standing there, the light catching in her hair, her composure softening as the music swelled. He should not imagine it, and yet he could not stop. Gabriel cursed under his breath and crossed to the window. Snow threatened again. The sky hung low and gray. London would be difficult to navigate by evening. Perhaps he should have postponed the rehearsal altogether. It was unnecessary. The boy had already proved himself capable during the caroling, but the thought of not hearing that voice again, of not seeing her again, unsettled him more than the thought of impropriety. He had arranged everything through proper channels, naturally. The invitation had been sent through Miss Kemp, carefully phrased so as not to seem too presumptuous. Mrs. Winslow had accepted, though he suspected reluctantly. The children would come. She would come. 3 more hours. He moved to the hearth and let his fingers rest on the mantle's edge. The marble was cold beneath his touch. He should be thinking about music, about his guests for the concert, about the dozens of details that required his attention. Instead, he was thinking about a widow with wary eyes and a smile she never let reach her lips. He had admired beauty before, many times, but never like this. Never with such quiet disquiet. Never with the sense that something fundamental had shifted and he could not shift it back. "Lord Wrentham?" Mrs. Trent called softly from the doorway. "The music room is ready. Shall I have tea prepared for your guests when they arrive?" "Yes," he said, turning from the window, "and ensure the nursery is aired. The little girl may need a place to rest if the rehearsal runs long." Mrs. Trent's eyebrows rose slightly. He never concerned himself with such details. But she merely curtsied. "Of course, my lord." When she'd gone, he remained a while longer in the silence, staring into the empty music room. The garlands rustled faintly in the draught, a soft whisper of green and pine. He had told himself that Christmas was a foolish sentiment, a season of noise and pretense. Yet somehow, this year it had found its way into his home, into his mind, and, most annoyingly, into his heart. He straightened his cuffs, adjusted his cravat, and told himself he was ready. He didn't believe it for a moment. Meg stood before the small mirror in her borrowed room and tried not to see what she had become. The dress was gray, good gray wool, serviceable and proper, but gray nonetheless. She'd worn it so often in the past year that the cuffs were beginning to fray. She'd covered the worn spots with fresh lace from her sewing box, but the effect was more pitiful than elegant. Still, it was the best she had. the only gown that didn't proclaim her poverty quite so loudly. Her hair, at least, cooperated. She'd pinned it simply, allowing a few curls to frame her face. Nothing elaborate. She couldn't afford the pins or the time a lady's maid would provide. But neat, presentable. She looked like exactly what she was, a poor relation trying very hard to pass as something more. "Mama, are you ready?" Theo appeared in the doorway, his face bright with excitement. He wore his best coat, the one she'd let out twice already to accommodate his growing limbs. In another few months, it would be too small entirely. "Miss Kemp said we should arrive precisely at 2 o'clock. It's nearly 1:30 now." "I know, darling." Meg forced a smile. "Where is your sister?" "She's been ready for an hour. She's sitting on the stairs with her doll, singing to it." Of course she was. Lottie had been impossible all morning, chattering about the tall man's house and whether there would be cakes. Meg had tried to explain that this was a rehearsal, not a party, but her daughter's enthusiasm was impervious to reason. Meg's own feelings were decidedly less cheerful. She did not want to go to Gabriel Sterling's home, did not want to walk through rooms that would remind her of everything she'd lost, the life she might have had if she'd been born with a better dowry or married a richer man, did not want to stand in his music room and feel the weight of his gaze while pretending she didn't notice. Most of all, she did not want to admit that a small, treacherous part of her had thought of little else for 3 days. She'd told herself it was anxiety, concern for Theo, worry about the performance. But lying awake last night, she'd been forced to acknowledge the truth. She wanted to see him again, wanted to know if the warmth in his eyes had been real or imagined, wanted to discover if proximity would cure this inconvenient fascination or only make it worse. It was foolish, dangerous. He was an earl, and she was a widow living on charity. There could be nothing between them but the gulf of their circumstances. And yet, Mama? Theo's voice pulled her back. "Are you certain you're well? You've been staring at nothing for ages." "I'm fine, my love." She turned from the mirror and smoothed his hair. "Just thinking." "About Lord Wrentham?" Her heart stumbled. "Why would you say that?" Theo shrugged, his expression too knowing for 8 years old. "Because you've looked like that ever since Reverend Baker came. All worried, but not the usual worried." Out of the mouths of children, Meg bent and kissed his forehead. "I'm not worried. I'm proud. You're going to sing beautifully." "I know," he said with the confidence of youth. "His lordship said I was an artist. Artists aren't nervous. Even artists get nervous," Meg corrected gently. "But they perform anyway. That's what makes them brave." Theo considered this, then nodded. "Will you be brave too, Mama?" The question landed with unexpected weight. "I'll try," she said honestly. They collected Lottie from the stairs. The child was indeed singing to her doll, like a tuneless rendition of "God Rest Ye Merry Gentlemen," and made their way outside. Meg had arranged for a hired carriage, one of the cheapest available. The interior smelled of old leather and someone else's perfume, and the springs creaked with every rut in the road. Theo pressed his face to the window, watching London slide past. Lottie bounced on the seat, making her doll dance, and Meg sat with her hands folded in her lap, trying not to think about the moment when she would step down from this shabby conveyance in front of Gabriel Sterling's elegant townhouse, trying not to imagine what he would think when he saw her arrive like this, a widow in a worn gray dress, her children squeezed into outgrown clothes, all of them pretending to be something they were not. The carriage turned onto Brook Street, and Meg's breath caught. His house was beautiful. Not ostentatious, but unmistakably grand, tall windows gleaming in the winter light, a black painted door with brass fittings that shone like gold, steps swept clean of snow. A footman in livery stood at attention near the entrance. The hired carriage stopped. The driver opened the door and offered his hand, and Meg descended with as much dignity as she could muster. Theo followed, his eyes wide. Lottie tumbled out last, nearly dropping her doll in her excitement. "It's a palace!" Lottie breathed. "It's a townhouse," Meg corrected, but her voice lacked conviction. To a child who'd spent the last 6 months in William's modest home, this must indeed look like a palace. To Meg, who remembered ballrooms and country estates from her youth, it looked like everything she'd once taken for granted and could never have again. The footman approached. "Mrs. Winslow?" Lord Wrentham is expecting you. Please, come this way." They were ushered inside, and Meg's first impression was of light and warmth. The hall was hung with garlands of pine and holly, their scent filling the air. Candles gleamed in sconces that had been polished until they shone. The floor was marble, pale and perfect, and a sweeping staircase curved upward to the floors above. It was, she realized with a sinking heart, exactly the sort of home she'd once dreamed of having. "Mama, look!" Theo pointed to a painting on the wall, a landscape of rolling hills and distant mountains. "Do you think that's his estate?" "I don't know, darling. Don't point." "Mrs. Winslow." The voice came from the doorway to their left, and Meg turned. Gabriel Sterling stood in the entrance to what must be the drawing room, one hand resting lightly on the doorframe. He was dressed more casually than she'd seen him before. No greatcoat, no hat, just a perfectly tailored coat and buckskin breeches that emphasized the lean lines of his frame. His cravat was simply tied, his dark hair slightly disheveled as if he'd been running his hands through it. He looked, she thought with dismay, utterly devastating. "My lord." She curtsied, and her children followed suit. Theo with careful precision, Lottie with an enthusiastic wobble that nearly sent her sprawling. Gabriel's lips curved slightly. "Welcome. I trust your journey was not too difficult." "Not at all," Meg lied. His gaze flicked to the window, where the shabby hired carriage was just pulling away, and something shifted in his expression. Understanding, perhaps. Or pity. She couldn't tell which was worse. "The music room is ready," he said, his tone carefully neutral. "Shall we?" He led them down a corridor lined with more paintings, landscapes, portraits, a still life of fruit that looked expensive enough to feed a family for a month. Theo walked beside him, asking questions about the house with the unself-conscious curiosity of a child. Lottie skipped ahead, her doll bouncing in her arms, and Meg followed, acutely aware of the worn hem of her dress, the frayed lace at her cuffs, the way her half-boots clicked too loudly on the polished floors. She did not belong here. That much was painfully clear. But Theo did, and for his sake, she would endure this, even if it meant standing in Gabriel Sterling's beautiful house and pretending her heart wasn't breaking just a little at the reminder of everything she'd lost. The music room took Gabriel's breath away every time he entered it, and he'd designed the damned thing himself. But watching Mrs. Winslow step through the doorway, watching her face as she took in the soaring ceiling, the tall windows that let in floods of winter light, the gleaming pianoforte, the small stage with its perfect acoustics, he saw it anew. Her expression was carefully controlled, but he caught the flicker of wonder before she suppressed it. The way her gaze lingered on the instrument, on the rows of chairs arranged for his guests, on the garlands that framed the windows like something from a painting. She was trying very hard not to be impressed. It made him want to show her everything. The library with its thousands of volumes, the conservatory where he grew roses even in winter, the gallery where his ancestors glowered down from their frames. He wanted to see that wonder again, unguarded and real. Instead, he gestured toward the stage. "The acoustics are excellent. Your son should have no difficulty being heard, even in the back rows." "It's beautiful," Theo breathed, moving toward the pianoforte as if drawn by invisible strings. "May I?" "Of course," Gabriel nodded toward the instrument. "Do you play?" "Mama is teaching me, but we don't have a pianoforte anymore." The boy's voice held no self-pity, just simple fact. "We had to sell it after Papa died." Silence fell, heavy and awkward. Meg's cheeks flushed pink, and Gabriel cursed himself for asking. Of course they didn't have an instrument. Of course they'd sold it. She'd probably sold everything that wasn't nailed down. "I see," he said quietly. "Well, you're welcome to play this one whenever you like." Meg's head snapped up, her eyes meeting his. "That's very kind, my lord, but we couldn't possibly—" "It sits idle most of the year," he said, cutting off her protest. "It would be a shame to let it go unplayed. Consider it, practice, for the concert." Her jaw tightened. She knew what he was doing, offering charity disguised as practicality, and her pride bristled against it. He could see the refusal forming on her lips. "Please, Mama." Theo was already at the bench, his small hands hovering over the keys with barely contained longing. "Just to practice?" She looked at her son, and something in her expression softened, crumbled just a little. "Very well," she said quietly, for practice only. Gabriel felt an absurd surge of victory. Lottie, meanwhile, had discovered the stage and was twirling on it, her doll held high like a dance partner. "Look, Mama, I'm a princess." "Lottie, come down from there." Meg moved forward, but Gabriel held up a hand. "Let her play. There's no harm in it." Meg hesitated, then nodded. She looked exhausted, he realized. Not physically, though there were shadows beneath her eyes that spoke of poor sleep, but emotionally, as if simply being here in his home required more strength than she had to spare. He wanted to ask what had worn her down so thoroughly, wanted to know what kept her awake at night, what made her shoulders curve inward as if braced against a blow. Wanted to fix it, whatever it was, and see her smile without that careful guard she kept in place. Instead, he said, "Shall we begin? Theo, whenever you're ready." The boy stood, moving to the center of the stage with a composure that belied his 8 years. He looked small up there, a child in outgrown clothes on a stage meant for professionals. But when he opened his mouth and began to sing, the room transformed. "Lully, Lulla, thou little tiny child." The same carol from Bond Street, but here, in this space Gabriel had designed for music, it was transcendent. The boy's voice soared, pure and effortless, filling the room with a sweetness that made Gabriel's chest ache. Every note was perfect, every phrase shaped with an instinct that couldn't be taught. He glanced at Mrs. Winslow. She stood perfectly still, her hands clasped before her, but her face, God, her face. All the careful control had melted away. Pride and love and something fiercer shone in her eyes, and her lips curved in a smile so tender it made Gabriel forget to breathe. This was what she looked like when her guard was down, when she wasn't thinking about propriety or poverty or the 100 small humiliations she endured, when she was simply a mother watching her son do something extraordinary. She was beautiful, not in the way London beauties were beautiful, not polished or practiced or aware of their power, but in a way that bypassed his reason entirely and went straight to something deeper. Something he hadn't known was still capable of responding. The carol ended. The last note hung in the air like a held breath, then faded into silence. Meg's eyes were bright with tears she didn't let fall. "Oh, my darling," she whispered, "that was perfect." Theo grinned, flushed with success. "Did you hear how the room made it louder? It's like magic." "It's called acoustics," Gabriel said, his voice rougher than intended. He cleared his throat. "But yes, rather like magic." "Can I sing again?" Theo asked. "Please. I want to try another one." "Of course." Gabriel moved toward the stage, then hesitated. "Mrs. Winslow, would you join us? I find that singers often benefit from having someone they trust nearby during rehearsals." It was a flimsy excuse. The boy clearly needed no such thing, but she didn't call him on it. After a moment, she nodded and moved forward, climbing the 2 steps to the stage with careful dignity, despite her worn dress. She stood beside her son, one hand resting lightly on his shoulder, and Gabriel found himself unable to look away. Theo began another carol, O come, Emmanuel," and this time Gabriel barely heard it. He was too busy watching her, the way the light from the windows caught in her hair, turning it to warm chestnut, the way her lips moved slightly with the words, as if she couldn't help singing along silently, the way her entire being focused on her son with a fierce, protective love that made something in Gabriel's chest twist painfully. He had never wanted children, had never understood the appeal of noise and chaos and the endless responsibility of small lives depending on him. His own childhood had been full of duty and expectation, and he'd vowed never to inflict that on another generation. But watching Meg with her children, with Theo's clear voice filling his music room and Lottie playing princess on the stage, he felt something shift, a want he hadn't known existed, a hunger for something beyond his carefully ordered solitary life. The song ended. Theo bowed, clearly pleased with himself. "Excellent," Gabriel said, finding his voice. "Truly remarkable. The guests will be astounded." "Do you think so?" Theo's eyes shone. "Truly, truly." Gabriel smiled, and it felt strange on his face, genuine rather than polite. "You have a rare gift, young man. Don't ever let anyone tell you otherwise." Meg's hand tightened on her son's shoulder, and when Gabriel looked up, her eyes met his. For a moment, just a moment, there was no careful distance between them, no walls of propriety or circumstance, just 2 people seeing each other clearly. Then Lottie shrieked with laughter, having tangled herself in her doll's ribbons, and the spell broke. "Lottie!" Meg moved quickly, untangling her daughter with practiced efficiency. "I told you to be careful." "But I was dancing, Mama. Princesses always dance." "Princesses also listen to their mothers," Meg said, but there was no heat in it. Gabriel watched them, this small, imperfect family who'd stumbled into his perfectly ordered life and somehow made it feel less empty. He should send them home, should maintain the distance that propriety and common sense demanded. Instead, he heard himself say, "Mrs. Winslow, would you and the children join me for tea? It seems a shame to rush off when we've only just begun." She looked up, surprised. "Oh, that's very kind, but we shouldn't impose." "You're not imposing. I'm inviting." He smiled slightly. "Besides, I believe I owe young Theo here a proper tour of the music room. He asked at least a dozen questions about the acoustics that I haven't yet answered." Theo's face lit up. "Really? You'd show me?" "If your mother agrees." All eyes turned to Meg. Gabriel watched her internal struggle play out across her face, pride warring with practicality, worry fighting with her son's obvious joy. Finally, she nodded. "Very well, but we mustn't stay long." "Of course not," Gabriel agreed, though he was already planning how to extend their visit as long as possible. Mrs. Trent appeared as if summoned, ready to escort them to the drawing room for tea. But as the children followed the housekeeper chattering about cakes and music, Meg lingered. She turned to Gabriel, her expression serious. "My lord, I want to thank you for this, for giving Theo this opportunity, whatever else." She paused, seeming to choose her words carefully. "He will remember this day for the rest of his life." "And you?" Gabriel asked quietly. "Will you remember it?" Her breath caught. For a moment, she simply looked at him, and he saw it again, that flicker of something unguarded, something that might have been longing or regret or hope. He couldn't tell which. "Yes," she said finally, "I will remember." Then she turned and followed her children, leaving Gabriel standing alone in his music room with the fading echo of a boy's song and the ghost of a woman's smile. He should not want more of her, should not be planning reasons to see her again, to bring them back to his home, to find excuses to be near her. But as he followed them toward the drawing room, listening to Lottie's bright laughter and Theo's endless questions, Gabriel realized with perfect, terrible clarity that what he should do and what he would do were two entirely different things. And for the first time in his careful, controlled life, he found he didn't care. Chapter 4. Tea was a disaster. Not in any obvious way. The children were well behaved, the cakes were excellent, and Lord Wrentham played the role of gracious host with effortless charm. But for Meg, every moment was an exquisite torture. She sat in his drawing room, a room larger than William's entire parlor, and tried to hold her teacup without rattling the saucer. Tried to answer his polite questions without revealing too much. Tried to keep Lottie from climbing on the furniture, or Theo from asking questions that revealed just how poor they truly were. And through it all, she was painfully, desperately aware of him. The way he listened when Theo spoke, as if an 8-year-old's observations about music were genuinely interesting. The way he let Lottie show him her doll without a trace of impatience. The way his gaze kept finding hers across the room, those dark eyes holding questions she couldn't answer. "More tea, Mrs. Winslow?" His voice was low, intimate, despite the proper distance between them. "No, thank you, my lord. We really should." "Just a little longer, Mama?" Theo pleaded. His lordship was going to show me how the pianoforte strings work. Gabriel smiled. "Only if your mother permits it." Of course he would defer to her, would give her the choice while making it impossible to refuse without disappointing her son. He was infuriatingly good at this, at maneuvering her into precisely where he wanted her without ever being indelicate about it. "Very well," she said, setting down her cup. "But then we truly must go. We've taken enough of his lordship's time." "Nonsense." Gabriel stood, offering his hand to help her rise. "I have nowhere else to be." His fingers were warm through her glove, warm and strong and far too appealing. Meg withdrew her hand the moment propriety allowed and busied herself gathering Lottie's things. They returned to the music room, where Gabriel lifted the pianoforte's lid to show Theo the intricate arrangement of strings and hammers. Her son leaned in, fascinated, asking questions, Gabriel answered with surprising patience, and Meg stood to the side, watching them, and felt her carefully constructed walls begin to crumble. This was dangerous. All of it. The way Gabriel looked at her children, the way they responded to him, the way she'd begun to imagine in brief, traitorous moments what it might be like if this weren't temporary, if this strange, impossible connection could be something real. But it couldn't. She was a widow living on charity, and he was an earl who could have his pick of London's finest ladies. There was no future here, only borrowed time in a beautiful house that would never be hers. "Mama?" Lottie tugged at her skirt. "I'm tired." "I know, sweetheart." Meg bent to pick her up, but Gabriel was suddenly there, his hands gentle as he lifted the child with easy strength. "There's a nursery upstairs," he said quietly. "She could rest there while Theo finishes his questions." "Oh no, we couldn't possibly." "Mrs. Winslow." His voice was firm but not unkind. "Let me help, please." The please undid her. That and the genuine concern in his eyes, as if he truly cared whether a 4-year-old was comfortable, as if they mattered to him. "Thank you," she whispered. He carried Lottie upstairs, Meg following, and settled the drowsy child on a daybed in a room clearly designed for children, though his own, as far as she knew, didn't exist. Lottie was asleep within moments, her doll clutched tight. They stood together in the doorway, watching her sleep, and the intimacy of it struck Meg like a blow. This was what married people did. Parents, partners, not an earl and a widow who had no business being alone together in a nursery. "She's lovely," Gabriel said quietly. "They both are." "Thank you." Meg's throat felt tight. "They're all I have. I know. 2 words. Just 2 words. But the way he said them, with such understanding, such quiet acknowledgement of everything she'd lost and everything she was trying to protect, made tears prick behind her eyes. She turned away before he could see. "We should return to Theo. Mrs. Winslow." His hand touched her elbow, the lightest pressure. "Margaret." Her name. He'd used her name. Not Mrs. Winslow, not ma'am, but Margaret. And hearing it in his voice, low and rough with something she didn't dare name, made her heart stutter in her chest. She turned back to face him and found him far too close. Close enough to see the gold flecks in his dark eyes. Close enough to smell the faint scent of his cologne, something expensive and subtly male. Close enough that if she swayed forward even slightly, she could... "I should go," she said, but didn't move. "You should," he agreed, but he didn't move either. They stood there, frozen in the doorway of the nursery, with Lottie sleeping peacefully behind them and the rest of the world very far away. The air felt charged, heavy with things neither of them could say. "The concert," he said finally. "After the concert, may I call on you? Properly, at your brother-in-law's home." Meg's breath caught. A formal call. The first step in courtship. He was asking permission to court her. "My lord." "Gabriel, when we're alone, can you not call me Gabriel?" "Gabriel," she whispered, testing his name on her tongue. It felt dangerous. Intimate. "Right? You don't know what you're asking. I'm asking to know you better, to see where this leads." His voice was quiet, steady, with propriety, with respect for your circumstances and your children. He paused, and something flickered in his expression. Vulnerability, hope. "Though I'll confess propriety feels rather thin when I'm standing this close to you." She managed a shaky laugh. "You shouldn't." "I know." His hand lifted as if to touch her face, then fell. "But may I? Will you allow me to call?" She should say no. Should protect herself, protect her children, protect her precarious position in William's household. A courtship with an earl would cause talk, would create expectations she couldn't meet, would end badly when he realized the gulf between their worlds was too wide to bridge. But looking into his eyes, seeing the hope there, the same desperate, terrifying hope she felt, she couldn't refuse. "Yes," she whispered, "you may call." His smile was like sunrise breaking through storm clouds. "Thank you." "I don't." She stopped, swallowed. "I don't know what you expect to find. Neither do I." His honesty surprised her. "But I know I can't walk away without trying. Can you?" Could she? Could she turn her back on the strange, impossible thing growing between them? Could she choose safety over hope, caution over possibility? "No," she admitted, "I can't." "Then we'll find out together." He stepped back, restoring the proper distance between them, but his eyes stayed on hers. "After the concert. I'll call the next day if you'll permit it." "The next day?" Her voice came out too breathless. "I find I'm not particularly patient." That slight smile again, the one that made her heart stumble. "Not where you're concerned." A sound from below, Theo calling for his mother, broke the moment. They stepped apart, propriety reasserting itself like a cold wind. But something had shifted. Something had been acknowledged. "I should collect my son," Meg said, her voice steadier now. "Of course." Gabriel gestured toward the stairs. "I'll see you to your carriage." They descended together, found Theo still examining the pianoforte with reverent attention, and began the process of gathering children and belongings. Throughout it all, Meg felt Gabriel's presence like a physical thing, awareness humming beneath her skin, anticipation building with every glance. When they reached the entrance hall, the hired carriage already waiting beyond the door, Gabriel took her hand for the formal goodbye. His fingers lingered just a moment too long, his thumb brushing across her knuckles through the thin fabric of her glove. "Until the concert, Mrs. Winslow," he said, voice carefully neutral for the servant's benefit. "Until the concert, my lord." She curtsied, then added, so quietly only he could hear, "Gabriel." His hand tightened on hers, then released. She gathered her children and descended the steps, aware of him watching from the doorway until the carriage turned the corner. Only then did she lean back against the worn seat and close her eyes. "Mama?" Theo's voice was sleepy, satisfied. "That was the best day." "Was it, darling?" "Lord Wrentham is nice. He understands about music, and he didn't mind when I asked too many questions." "He liked your questions," Meg said, opening her eyes to smile at her son. "He's a kind man. Will we see him again?" Meg's throat tightened. "Yes, at the concert." "And after?" Theo's eyes were far too perceptive. "Will he come visit us?" "Perhaps," Meg said carefully. "Would you like that?" Theo considered seriously. "I think so. Lottie likes him, and he makes you smile, Mama. You don't smile enough." Out of the mouths of children. Meg pulled him close, pressing a kiss to his hair. "I'll try to smile more." "Good," Theo said and yawned. "When Lord Wrentham visits, you smile a lot, so he should visit more." She had no answer to that, so she simply held her son and watched London slide past the grimy window, thinking about an earl who'd asked to call on her, who'd looked at her as if she mattered, who'd made her believe, for one dangerous, wonderful moment, that perhaps impossible things were possible after all. Gabriel stood at the window long after the hired carriage had disappeared around the corner. The house felt too quiet without them, too empty, too much like it had felt before they'd come. "Mrs." Trent appeared in the doorway. "Shall I have the music room tidied, my lord?" "Leave it," he said. "Just leave it for now." When she'd gone, he walked back to the music room and stood in the center of the stage where Theo had sung. The room still held an echo of that clear, pure voice, still smelled faintly of pine and the sweet scent he'd begun to associate with Margaret. Margaret. He'd asked permission to call on her. Formal courtship. The words had come out before he'd fully thought them through, but he didn't regret them. Couldn't regret them. Not when she'd looked at him with those wide, wondering eyes and whispered yes. He was courting a widow with 2 children and no fortune. A woman who lived on her brother-in-law's charity and wore frayed lace at her cuffs. A woman so far beneath his station that his mother would have apoplexy when she found out. And he didn't care. Not about the scandal. Not about society's judgment. Not about any of the practical objections that should have stopped him. He cared about the way she looked at her children. The way she'd stood in his music room listening to Theo sing, her face transformed by pride and love. The way she'd challenged him, defended her son's dignity, refused to be awed by his wealth or intimidated by his title. He cared about the way his house felt when she was in it, alive, warm, real. As if all the careful order and polished beauty meant nothing without someone to share it with. 3 days until the concert. 3 days until he'd see her again. And the day after, if she didn't change her mind, if she didn't come to her senses, he would call on her at her brother-in-law's house, would sit in a formal parlor under the watchful eye of chaperones and try to conduct a proper courtship. The thought should have terrified him. He'd avoided courtship for 10 years, refused every match his mother had suggested, maintained his careful freedom. Instead, he felt something uncomfortably close to joy. Gabriel crossed to the pianoforte and touched the keys Theo had admired. His house had always been full of beautiful things, art, music, carefully curated perfection. But none of it had meant anything. It had all been hollow, expensive emptiness, until a widow and her children had walked into his music room and made him remember what it felt like to want something more than duty and obligation. To want someone, specifically and fiercely, regardless of consequence. He didn't know what he was doing. Didn't know if this could work, if society would allow it, if she would even let herself believe it was real. But he knew three things with absolute certainty. He would call on her after the concert. He would find a way to make this work, and he would not let her slip away into poverty and obscurity when he could offer them all, something better. Even if it meant fighting his family, society, and every practical objection that stood between them. She was worth it. They all were. 3 days. He could be patient for 3 days, though patience, he was discovering, had never been quite so difficult before. Chapter 5. The morning of the concert arrived gray and cold, the sky promising snow before nightfall. Meg woke before dawn, her stomach tight with nerves that had nothing to do with Theo's performance and everything to do with seeing Gabriel again. 3 days had passed since the rehearsal. 3 days of pretending she wasn't counting hours. 3 days of telling herself that his request to call on her had been a moment's madness he'd surely regret. She dressed in the same gray wool she'd worn to the rehearsal, her only option, and spent longer than necessary pinning her hair. Her hands shook slightly as she fastened the worn lace at her cuffs. Tonight, she would stand in Gabriel's music room surrounded by London's elite, a poor relation in a borrowed world, watching her son perform for people who would never consider her their equal. And afterward, Gabriel would call on her. If he didn't change his mind. If he didn't come to his senses and realize what a scandal it would cause. "Mama?" Theo appeared in her doorway, already dressed in his best clothes. His face was pale, his eyes too bright. "My stomach feels strange." She crossed to him immediately, pressing her hand to his forehead. "Cool, thank God. Nerves, darling, not illness. It feels like illness. I know." She knelt to his level, taking his hands. "But you've sung in that room before. You know it loves your voice. And tonight, you'll simply share that gift with people who want to hear it. What if they don't like it? They will." She said it with absolute certainty. But even if they didn't, even if every person in that room was deaf and foolish, it wouldn't change the truth. You have a remarkable voice, and you are brave for sharing it. He nodded, not quite convinced, but willing to trust her. "Will Lord Wrentham be there?" "Of course. It's his house." "Good." Theo's shoulders relaxed slightly. He understands. That simple faith, that certainty that Gabriel would somehow make everything right, should have comforted her. Instead, it terrified her. Her son was already attached, already looking to Gabriel as something more than a patron. If this ended badly, when this ended badly, Theo would be hurt. But she'd already said yes, already agreed to let Gabriel call, already opened the door to hope, and there was no closing it now without breaking her son's heart. "Come," she said, rising. "Let's have breakfast. Mrs. Trent promised there would be pastries after the concert, remember?" That earned a small smile. They descended together to find Lottie already awake and impossibly excited, chattering about the fancy party, while William's wife, Eleanor, looked on with barely concealed disapproval. "A concert at the Earl of Wrentham's house," Eleanor said, her tone suggesting Meg had arranged something vaguely scandalous. "How? Unexpected." "The church choir was invited," Meg said evenly. "Theo is singing with them." "Yes," William mentioned. Eleanor's gaze traveled over Meg's worn dress, her frayed cuffs, her simple hairstyle. "I do hope you won't embarrass us. The Earl moves in elevated circles." The words landed like small cuts, precise and deliberate. Meg kept her expression neutral. "I'll do my best to be invisible." "See that you are." Eleanor rose, smoothing her own expensive morning dress. "William will take you in the carriage. I've declined the invitation. Someone must maintain standards." The unspoken message was clear. You don't belong there, and I won't be complicit in your social climbing. After Eleanor left, Meg sat with her children and tried to eat breakfast she couldn't taste. The excitement that had carried her through 3 days curdled into anxiety. Eleanor was right. She didn't belong in Gabriel's world. What was she thinking, agreeing to let him call? What could possibly come of this except humiliation? But then Theo looked up at her with those bright, nervous eyes, and she remembered. She wasn't doing this for herself. She was doing it for him, for the chance to give him something more than poverty and borrowed rooms and a mother who'd forgotten how to hope, even if it broke her heart in the end. Gabriel stood in his music room and tried not to pace. Guests would begin arriving within the hour. The musicians were warming up in the drawing room, the carolers gathering in the servants' hall, Mrs. Trent overseeing final preparations with military precision. Everything was ready. Everything except him. He'd barely slept in 3 days, had drafted and discarded a dozen notes to Margaret, had walked past her brother-in-law's house twice, ostensibly on other business, hoping for a glimpse of her, had failed spectacularly at pretending this evening didn't matter. Gabriel. His mother's voice cut through his thoughts. There you are. He turned to find Lady Wrentham sweeping into the music room, his sister Caroline following in her wake. He'd known they were coming. His mother had written to say she wouldn't miss his first concert in 2 years, but he'd hoped for more time to prepare. Mother, Caroline. He bowed, kissing each of their cheeks. I didn't expect you until this evening. We arrived early to help with preparations. His mother's sharp eyes surveyed the room with approval. Though I see you've managed admirably without us. The garlands are lovely, very festive. Mrs. Trent's doing, of course. Lady Wrentham moved to the pianoforte, trailing one gloved finger along its polished surface. I'm pleased you decided to host after all. When you wrote to decline, I feared you'd become a complete hermit. I changed my mind. So I gathered. His mother turned to face him, and Gabriel braced himself. She had that look, the one that said she knew something he'd hoped to keep private. Caroline tells me you've taken an interest in a church choir. How philanthropic of you. The boy has an extraordinary voice. I'm sure he does. Her tone suggested she found this explanation insufficient. And the boy's mother? Does she have an extraordinary voice as well? Gabriel's jaw tightened. I don't know what you're implying. Don't you? Lady Wrentham smiled, but there was steel beneath it. You've hosted the choir at your home, arranged private rehearsals, sent rather generous donations to their church fund. One might think you've developed a sudden passion for sacred music. One might think I appreciate talent when I hear it. Or one might think you've finally taken an interest in a woman. His mother moved closer, lowering her voice. Caroline saw you on Bond Street, with a widow and her children. She said you looked attentive. Damn Caroline and her penchant for gossip. The widow's son sings in the choir. I stopped to compliment his performance. There's nothing scandalous in that. Of course not. But his mother's expression said she didn't believe him for a moment. Still, I thought I should mention. Lady Clarissa Penholm is attending this evening. She's been quite vocal about your interest in her earlier this season. It would be awkward if she felt slighted. Lady Clarissa and I have no understanding. She believes otherwise. Then she's mistaken. Gabriel kept his voice level with effort. I've made no promises to Lady Clarissa or anyone else. Good. His mother's smile turned genuine. Because if you're going to court someone, I'd rather she be someone you actually want. Even if she is. She paused delicately. Unexpected. Gabriel stared at his mother. You'd approve? I'd prefer you happy than married to some insipid girl with perfect bloodlines and no personality. Lady Wrentham patted his arm. But do be careful, darling. Society can be cruel to women in precarious positions. If you're going to pursue this, make your intentions clear. Don't let her be destroyed by gossip. Before Gabriel could respond, Mrs. Trent appeared to announce that the first guests were arriving. His mother swept out to greet them, Caroline following with a knowing smirk, and Gabriel was left alone with the uncomfortable realization that his interest in Margaret was apparently obvious to everyone. He should be more careful, should protect her reputation, should wait until after the concert to make any public acknowledgement of his interest. But when he thought of her arriving tonight, standing in his music room watching her son perform while society whispered about her circumstances, he wanted to stand beside her. To make it clear she was under his protection, to dare anyone to slight her. The door opened again, and he turned, half hoping it was her. Instead, Simon Bancroft strolled in, elegant as always, taking in the decorated room with an amused expression. "Well, this is unexpected. I thought you'd sworn off Christmas and all its works." "I changed my mind." Evidently. Simon's gaze sharpened. "Does this change of heart have anything to do with the rather pretty widow I saw you with on Bond Street, the one whose son sings like an angel?" "How does everyone know about Bond Street?" "London is a village, my friend. An expensive, gossipy village." Simon moved to the window, watching carriages begin to arrive. "Lady Clarissa is here. She's brought her mother. They both look determined." Gabriel cursed under his breath. "Shall I run interference?" Simon offered. "I'm quite good at charming difficult women. Please, consider it done." Simon straightened his cuffs. "Though you might want to make your intentions clear before the evening ends." Lady Clarissa aside, there are at least 3 other ambitious mothers downstairs with unmarried daughters. They'll descend like starving wolves if they sense vulnerability. "I'm not vulnerable." "No." Simon's expression turned serious. "But your widow might be. If you care about her, and I think you do, protect her. Make it clear she's not to be trifled with. I intend to call on her tomorrow." Simon's eyebrows rose. "That's rather fast." "I'm not a patient man." "No," Simon agreed, smiling. "You're really not. Well then, let's get through this concert without bloodshed, shall we?" By the time Meg arrived with William and the children, the music room was already half full of elegant strangers. She stood in the doorway, frozen by the sheer wealth on display. Silk gowns that cost more than she'd had in a year, jewels glittering at throats and wrists, the casual confidence of people who'd never worried about paying for coal or mending worn lace. "Mama?" Theo's hand found hers. "Are you all right?" She forced herself to smile. "Of course, darling. Come. Let's find where the choir is gathering." Miss Kemp appeared like a guardian angel, whisking Theo away to join the other carolers. Lottie clung to Meg's skirts, wide-eyed at the grandeur. William had already disappeared into the crowd, likely seeking the refreshment table and people of his own class. Meg found a chair near the back, hoping to be invisible. But as she sat, she felt eyes on her, assessing, curious, some openly hostile. A woman in peacock blue leaned toward her companion and whispered something that made them both laugh. Heat crept up Meg's neck. She should have stayed home. Should have sent Theo with Miss Kemp and the others. Should never have agreed to, Mrs. Winslow. Gabriel's voice, low and warm, came from behind her. "Thank you for coming." She turned, and there he was, immaculate in evening black, his cravat perfectly tied, every inch the Earl. But his eyes were gentle, concerned, and when he offered his hand to help her rise, she took it without thinking. "My lord," she curtsied, acutely aware of every gaze now fixed on them. "There are better seats near the front," he said, his voice carrying just enough to be heard by those nearest. "I've reserved them for Theo's family. Will you allow me to show you?" It was a public claim, a statement that she was here as his guest, not some charity case skulking in the back. The whispers intensified, but Gabriel's expression dared anyone to comment. "That's very kind," Meg managed. He led her to the 3rd row, where the chairs were cushioned and the view of the stage perfect. Lottie scrambled up beside her, and Gabriel bent to the child's level with a smile. "Hello, Miss Lottie. Your brother is very excited to sing for us." "I know," Lottie said importantly. "He practiced and practiced, but Mama says he's not nervous anymore. Your Mama is very wise." Gabriel straightened, his gaze meeting Meg's with an intensity that made her breath catch. "I'll see you after," he said quietly, for her alone. "Save me a moment?" She nodded, not trusting her voice. Then he was gone, moving through the crowd with practiced ease, and Meg sat in her cushioned chair, trying to ignore the stares and whispers and the pounding of her own heart. A woman in the row ahead turned to look at her, older, elegant, with sharp eyes that missed nothing. "You're the boy's mother?" she asked. "Yes." Meg lifted her chin. "I am." Lady Wrentham. The woman's smile was surprisingly warm. "Gabriel's mother. I'm very much looking forward to hearing your son sing." Gabriel's mother. Meg's mind went blank. She managed a curtsy from her seated position. "Thank you, my lady. That's very kind." "Not at all." Lady Wrentham's gaze traveled over Meg's worn dress, but her expression held curiosity rather than judgment. "It's rare to see my son take a personal interest in his guests. You must have made quite an impression." Before Meg could formulate a response that wasn't utterly incriminating, the musicians began to tune their instruments. Lady Wrentham turned back to face the stage, leaving Meg to wonder exactly how much Gabriel's mother knew, and whether that was a blessing or a disaster in the making. The concert began with a chamber ensemble playing Mozart. Then a soprano sang an Italian aria that brought tears to several ladies' eyes. Each performance was met with polite applause, the audience appreciative but controlled. Then the carolers filed onto the stage, Theo among them in his too small coat and carefully brushed hair. He looked impossibly young standing there, his face pale under the candlelight. Meg's hands clenched in her lap. They sang "God Rest Ye Merry Gentlemen" together, the harmonies rough but earnest. Then Miss Kemp announced that young Master Theo Whitmore would perform Coventry Carol as a solo. The room fell silent. Theo stepped forward, and for one terrible moment, Meg thought he would flee. His eyes found hers across the crowd, wide and frightened. She smiled, nodded. "You can do this." He took a breath and sang. "Lully, Lulla, thou little tiny child." The room transformed. That pure, crystalline voice filled every corner, each note perfect and effortless. The guests leaned forward, transfixed. Even the society matrons who'd been whispering earlier fell silent, captured by something they hadn't expected to find in a widow's 8-year-old son. Meg couldn't breathe, couldn't look away from her boy standing on that stage, sharing his gift with a room full of strangers. Pride swelled in her chest so fierce it hurt. When the final note faded, there was a moment of profound silence. Then applause erupted, not polite but genuine, people rising to their feet calling brava and extraordinary. Theo bowed, his face glowing, and Meg felt tears slide down her cheeks unchecked. Across the room, she caught Gabriel's gaze. He was watching her, not the stage, not Theo, her. And the expression on his face, wonder, tenderness, something that looked dangerously like love, made her heart stop entirely. After the final carol ended, the guests moved to the drawing room for refreshments. Meg tried to follow, but Lady Wrentham intercepted her with practiced ease. "Mrs. Winslow, a moment?" It was phrased as a question, but felt like a command. Meg's stomach dropped. "Of course, my lady." Lady Wrentham led her to a quiet corner, away from the crowd. When they were alone, she studied Meg with those sharp, assessing eyes that reminded her painfully of Gabriel. "Your son has a remarkable gift," she said finally. "Thank you, my lady." "He gets it from you, I assume? The musical talent?" Meg hesitated. I used to play. Before." She stopped. "Before Robert died. Before they sold the pianoforte. Before everything fell apart. Before widowhood reduced your circumstances." Lady Wrentham's tone was matter of fact, not cruel. "I understand. My own mother was widowed young. It's a difficult position." Meg said nothing, unsure where this was leading. "My son intends to call on you tomorrow," Lady Wrentham continued. "Don't look so shocked. He's told me nothing, but I know Gabriel. He's careful and controlled except when he actually wants something. Then he becomes terrifyingly single-minded." "My lady, let me finish." Lady Wrentham's voice was gentle but firm. "I don't know what's between you, and I won't pry. But I will say this, if Gabriel has decided to pursue you, nothing I say will stop him. And if you care for him even half as much as he clearly cares for you, you'll let him try." Meg's throat closed. "The difference in our stations is vast, I won't pretend otherwise." Lady Wrentham met her gaze steadily. "But my son has been half dead for 10 years. Duty without joy, obligation without purpose. Tonight, watching him watch your son perform, I saw him alive again. That's worth more than any perfect bloodline or dowry. Society will destroy us both. Probably." Lady Wrentham's smile turned wry. "But you survived widowhood and poverty with 2 children and your dignity intact. I suspect you're stronger than society gives you credit for." She paused. "Give him a chance, Mrs. Winslow. Give yourself a chance. Life is too short to choose safety over happiness." Before Meg could respond, Gabriel appeared, his expression carefully neutral. "Mother, you're not interrogating my guests, are you?" "Just having a pleasant conversation." Lady Wrentham patted Meg's arm. "Mrs. Winslow was telling me about her son's training. Fascinating woman." She swept away, leaving Meg and Gabriel alone in their corner. "What did she say?" Gabriel asked, concerned. "That you're terrifyingly single-minded when you want something." His mouth quirked. "Astute of her." "Gabriel," Meg glanced around, but no one was close enough to overhear. People are talking about us. Lady Clarissa Penholm has been staring daggers at me all evening. Let her. You don't understand. If this becomes gossip, if people think she couldn't finish, if people thought she was angling for an earl, using her son's talent to social climb, seducing a man far above her station, the whispers would destroy what little reputation she had left. Look at me. Gabriel's voice was quiet but commanding. When she met his eyes, he continued, Tomorrow, I will call on you at your brother-in-law's house, properly, openly, with all the respect due a woman I'm courting. Let society talk. Let them whisper. I don't care. Your mother just warned me society will destroy us. My mother also told you to give me a chance. He smiled slightly. She's a pragmatist. She knows the risks, but she also knows I've been miserable for a decade, and she wants me happy more than she wants me appropriate. What about what I want? The words came out sharper than intended. What if I don't want to be gossip fodder? What if I want to protect my children from scandal? Then tell me. His eyes searched hers. Tell me you don't want this. Tell me you don't feel what I feel. Tell me to walk away, and I will. Meg opened her mouth. The words should have been easy. Walk away. This is impossible. Protect yourself. But looking at him, at the hope and fear and desperate honesty in his expression, she couldn't say them. I can't, she whispered. Can't tell me to go, or can't feel this. Both. His smile was like dawn breaking. Then we'll figure it out. Together. You're impossible. Terrifyingly single-minded, he corrected. My mother said so. Despite everything, the fear, the impossibility, the whispers she could feel like insects crawling on her skin, Meg laughed. Actually laughed, here in Gabriel Sterling's house with half of London watching and her entire future balanced on a knife's edge. Tomorrow, Gabriel said. I'll call at 2:00 if that's acceptable. 2:00, Meg agreed. Good. His hand brushed hers, hidden in the folds of her skirt. Now go collect your children and let me escort you to your carriage like a proper gentleman. We'll give society something to talk about. I think we already have. Then let's give them something worth discussing. He offered his arm, and after a moment's hesitation, she took it. They walked through the crowd together. The earl and the widow, the patron and the mother, two people from different worlds who'd somehow found each other despite every reason they shouldn't. People stared. Of course they stared. But with Gabriel beside her, steady and sure and utterly unconcerned with propriety, Meg found she didn't care as much as she thought she would. Perhaps his mother was right. Perhaps she was stronger than society gave her credit for. Perhaps, impossibly, dangerously, this might actually work. Or perhaps they'd both crash and burn spectacularly. Either way, she was done choosing safety over hope. Chapter 6. Christmas Eve arrived gray and cold, the sky heavy with the promise of snow. Meg woke early and lay in the half-light, listening to the house settle around her. Today, Gabriel would call. At 2:00, he'd said, formal, proper, with all the respect due a woman he was courting. The thought sent equal measures of anticipation and dread through her chest. She rose and dressed with more care than usual, choosing the blue wool, her second-best gown, though still showing wear at the seams. Her hands shook slightly as she pinned her hair. In the mirror, she looked pale, uncertain, a widow of modest means preparing to receive an earl. What was she thinking? Downstairs, the house was in barely controlled chaos. Trunks stood in the hallway, half-packed. Servants hurried past with armloads of clothing and hat boxes. Eleanor's shrill voice echoed from somewhere above, issuing contradictory orders about what must go and what must stay. William and Eleanor were leaving for the country this afternoon, their annual Christmas at his mother's estate in Kent. They'd invited Meg and the children weeks ago, in that particular tone that made it clear the invitation was duty rather than desire. Meg had declined. Better to spend Christmas quietly here than to endure 3 days of Eleanor's barely veiled contempt and William's uncomfortable silence. She found Theo and Lottie in the nursery, already dressed and unusually subdued. Theo sat by the window, watching the street. Lottie played with her doll but kept glancing at her brother. Mama? Theo looked up. Is Lord Wrentham really coming today? Yes, darling, this afternoon. Will Aunt Eleanor be here? Meg heard the worry in his voice. Eleanor had been unusually cutting these past few days. Her comments about the concert and certain people's ambitions pointed enough that even Theo had noticed. For a little while, Meg said carefully, but they'll be leaving for the country soon after. Good, Theo said, then looked guilty. Is that wicked to say? No, my love, just honest. She settled them with books and promised they could see Lord Wrentham when he arrived, then descended to face whatever Eleanor had planned, because her sister-in-law had definitely planned something. Meg had seen that look before, the one that said Eleanor had decided something needed addressing, and consequences be damned. She found Eleanor in the drawing room, supervising the covering of furniture with Holland cloth. Her sister-in-law looked up, her smile sharp. Margaret, there you are. I wanted a word before the Earl arrives. Meg's stomach tightened. Of course. Eleanor dismissed the servants with a wave, then turned to face her fully. I think you should reconsider joining us in Kent. Christmas alone in this house with just the servants and children seems rather pitiful, though I suppose you're accustomed to making do. I'm quite content here, Meg said evenly. Are you? Eleanor's smile didn't reach her eyes. Or are you simply hoping for other visitors? The neighborhood has been quite full of talk since that concert. People do notice when a widow receives attentions above her station. There it was, the blade, perfectly aimed. Lord Wrentham asked permission to call, Meg said, keeping her voice steady. I saw no reason to refuse a courteous social visit. A social visit, Eleanor laughed, the sound brittle. Is that what you're calling it? Margaret, please. You're not foolish enough to believe an earl pays social visits to penniless widows out of mere courtesy. Everyone knows what this is. And what is it? Either a dalliance, which would be humiliating enough, or some misguided attempt at courtship, which would be infinitely worse. Eleanor moved closer, her voice dropping. Do you truly imagine he'll marry you? A widow with 2 children, and not a penny to her name? Men like the Earl of Wrentham don't marry women like you. They amuse themselves, and when they're finished, they move on. And you're left with a ruined reputation and children who suffer for their mother's poor judgment. Each word landed like a stone. Meg forced herself to meet Eleanor's gaze. You don't know his intentions. Don't I? Eleanor's smile turned pitying. Oh, my dear, you're even more naive than I thought. He's been kind to you, hasn't he? Charming, attentive, made you feel special, seen. And now you're halfway in love with him, imagining fairy tales where earls marry governesses. I'm not a governess. You might as well be. Your circumstances are identical, dependent, powerless, living on charity. Eleanor's voice softened into something almost kind, which was somehow worse. I'm trying to protect you, Margaret. I know you think me cruel, but I'm being realistic. If you continue this, whatever this is, society will destroy you. The gossip has already begun. Mrs. Pemberton cornered me at the milliner's yesterday, full of questions about dear Mrs. Winslow and her distinguished admirer. She was smiling when she said it, but the implications were clear. Meg's chest felt tight. I've done nothing improper. Intent doesn't matter. Appearance does. Eleanor moved to the window, gazing out at the street. When he calls today, I suggest you make it clear that his attentions, while flattering, are no longer welcome. Be gracious, be kind, but be firm. End this before it goes any further, for your sake and for the children's. And if I don't? Eleanor turned back, and her expression was cold now. Then you'll do it alone. William and I leave this afternoon, and we won't return until after 12th night. If scandal attaches itself to your name while you're living under our roof, it reflects on us as well. I won't have it, Margaret. I won't have my husband's family name dragged through the mud because you couldn't resist playing Cinderella with an earl. The threat was clear. Continue this, and you're no longer welcome here. Meg stood frozen, her mind racing. She had nowhere else to go. No income, no prospects, no family willing to take her in. William had been generous, grudging, but generous, in offering her a home. If Eleanor turned them out, I see you understand. Eleanor's voice was almost gentle now. I'm not your enemy, Margaret. I'm simply trying to help you see reason. Now, I believe you have some preparations to make before Lord Wrentham arrives. Do wear that blue wool. It's the most flattering thing you own. She swept from the room, leaving Meg standing alone among the shrouded furniture. At precisely 2 o'clock, the knock came. Meg sat in the parlor, her hands folded in her lap, her spine rigid. William stood by the fireplace, clearly uncomfortable. Eleanor sat near the window, the picture of propriety, her embroidery in her lap. The maid showed Gabriel in. He looked magnificent, impeccably dressed, every inch the Earl. But his eyes found Meg's immediately, and something in them softened, warmed. Lord Wrentham. Eleanor rose with a brilliant smile. What an unexpected honor. Do come in. William will keep us company. We're quite informal here, as you see. We're just finishing our packing, you know. We leave for Kent this afternoon. Such a pity Margaret and the children won't be joining us, but she insisted on remaining in town. Gabriel's gaze flickered to Eleanor, and Meg saw him take in the packed trunks visible in the hallway, the holland-covered furniture. His expression tightened slightly. Mrs. Winslow. He bowed to Eleanor, then turned to Meg. Mrs. Winslow, thank you for receiving me. She curtsied, not trusting her voice. Up close, she could see the faint shadows under his eyes, as if he hadn't slept well. The thought that he might have been as anxious about this meeting as she was made her chest ache. Please sit. Eleanor gestured to the chair across from Meg, the most formal arrangement possible. We were just discussing Christmas plans. Lord Wrentham, will you be in town for the holiday, or retiring to your country estate? I'll remain in London. His voice was carefully neutral. How unusual. Most families gather for Christmas. But then, I suppose bachelors have more freedom in such matters. Eleanor's smile was sweet poison. Margaret will be here as well with the children. Quite a quiet Christmas for them, I fear, but she insisted she'd be content. I'm sure she will be. Gabriel's tone held an edge now. Mrs. Winslow, I hope your children are well? Very well, thank you, my lord. The conversation limped forward, stilted and awkward. Every attempt Gabriel made to address Meg directly, Eleanor interrupted with some observation or question. William shifted uncomfortably, clearly wishing to be anywhere else. The clock on the mantel ticked away the minutes with excruciating slowness. Finally, a servant appeared in the doorway. Mr. Winslow, sir, the coachman needs your direction about the trunks. William seized the escape. Forgive me, I'll return momentarily. He fled. Eleanor waited until his footsteps faded, then rose and moved to the window, making a show of examining the sky. It looks like snow, she said to no one in particular. I do hope the roads won't be too difficult. It was the closest thing to privacy they'd had. Gabriel leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping. Are you well? He asked quietly. Yes, Meg whispered. Yes. You seem, he hesitated, distressed. She couldn't meet his eyes. It's nothing, only Margaret. The sound of her name made her look up. His expression was concerned, searching. If something's wrong, tell me, please. She opened her mouth, but Eleanor spoke first. You mustn't mind Margaret, Lord Wrentham. Eleanor turned from the window, her smile firmly in place. She's been quite overwhelmed by your attention. The concert, the rehearsals. One does hope she hasn't given you the wrong impression. I'm sure you understand. A widow in her position must be so very careful about appearances. People are already saying the most extraordinary things. Meg felt the blood drain from her face. Eleanor. I'm merely being helpful, dear. Eleanor's voice was honey over steel. His lordship deserves to know what he's walking into. The gossip has been quite vivid. Mrs. Pemberton told me just yesterday that half the neighborhood believes Margaret has been using Theo's talent to secure your interest, my lord. Naturally, I defended her, but one can't stop people from talking, and children do hear such things. Poor Theo and Lottie, one worries about what they might overhear at church or in the park. Gabriel's jaw tightened. I care nothing for gossip. Perhaps you should, my lord. Eleanor sat back down, picking up her embroidery with calculated casualness. For Margaret's sake, if not your own, a courtship between an earl and a penniless widow with 2 children, society will destroy her. You know it as well as I do. And the children, they'll suffer most. Children always do when their mother's reputation is questioned. Schools won't take them. Decent families won't receive them. All because their mother allowed herself to be noticed. The words hung in the air like poison. Meg watched Gabriel's expression shift from anger to something that looked like realization. He was seeing it, the trap Eleanor had laid, the impossible position Meg was in. Fight for this, and her children suffer. Accept his courtship, and watch society close its doors to Theo and Lottie. Surely, Gabriel said carefully, there are ways to manage such concerns. If a courtship were conducted properly, with all due respect. Respect, Eleanor laughed softly. My dear Lord Wrentham, respect is precisely what Margaret will lose. The moment you call on her a second time, every drawing room in London will be speculating about when you'll tire of your little charity project. And when you do, because men of your station always do, Margaret will be left to pick up the pieces of a ruined reputation. Eleanor, please, Meg's voice cracked. That's enough. Is it? Her sister-in-law met her gaze, implacable. Or have I not been clear enough? Let me be plain then. If you continue this association, Margaret, you and the children will need to find other lodgings. I won't have scandal attached to William's household. The silence that followed was deafening. Meg couldn't breathe, couldn't think. The room seemed to tilt around her. You would turn her out? Gabriel's voice was quiet, dangerous. On Christmas? I would save her from herself. Eleanor's smile didn't waver. This is kindness, my lord, though it may not seem so. Better a bit of pain now than ruin later. I'm sure you understand. You seem an intelligent man. Gabriel turned to Meg, his expression torn between fury and helplessness. She saw the moment he understood, truly understood, the choice she had to make. Fight for this and her children lose their home. Continue seeing him, and Eleanor would make good on her threat. Mrs. Winslow. His voice was rough. Meg, you don't have to. Yes. Yes, the word came out steadier than she felt. I do. She stood, her hands clenched at her sides to stop their shaking. I'm grateful for your kindness, Lord Wrentham. To me and to my children, you've been more generous than I deserved. But Eleanor speaks truly. I was foolish to imagine. Her voice caught. She forced herself to continue. This was a mistake. I should never have encouraged your attention. Meg, please. She couldn't look at him. If she looked at him, she'd break. You've been very kind, but I must think of Theo and Lottie. Their welfare must come before anything else. I'm sure you understand. The silence stretched. She could feel his gaze on her, willing her to look up, to take it back. But she kept her eyes fixed on the carpet, on the worn pattern she'd memorized over months of living in this house that wasn't hers, dependent on the charity of people who wanted her gone. I see. His voice was carefully controlled. Then I apologize for any distress I've caused you. It was never my intention. I know. The words were barely a whisper. She heard him stand, heard the rustle of his coat. She didn't look up, couldn't, even when she heard him move toward the door. Merry Christmas, Mrs. Winslow. The formality of it felt like a knife. I hope the season brings you peace. She managed a curtsy, still not meeting his eyes. Merry Christmas, my lord. Then he was gone. The door closed behind him with a soft click that sounded like the end of something. Meg remained standing, staring at nothing, her chest so tight she couldn't breathe. There. Eleanor's voice was brisk, satisfied. That's done. You'll thank me one day, Margaret. I've saved you from a terrible scandal. An earl doesn't marry his widowed charity case, no matter how prettily her son sings. He would have ruined you and discarded you. At least this way, you keep your dignity. Dignity. Meg almost laughed. She felt no dignity, only the hollow ache of something precious lost before she'd even had the chance to name it. William returned, oblivious to what had transpired. The trunks are loaded. Are we ready to depart? Quite ready. Eleanor gathered her things. Margaret, you're certain you won't reconsider? There's still room in the carriage. I'm certain. Meg's voice sounded distant, unfamiliar. Thank you. Travel safely. Within the hour, they were gone. The house emptied of their noise and bustle, leaving only the echoes and the servants preparing for their own half-holiday. Meg stood in the parlor, in the sudden quiet, and let herself feel the full weight of what had just happened. She'd sent him away, chosen safety over hope, protected her children by destroying the one chance at happiness she'd had in 4 years. Eleanor was right. It was the practical choice, the sensible choice. It felt like death. By evening, she'd composed herself enough to take the children to church. The vicar spoke of joy and peace, of hope born in unexpected places. Meg sat in the pew and tried to believe it, tried to ignore the way her chest ached every time she thought of Gabriel's face when she'd asked him to leave. Theo leaned against her shoulder. Mama, will Lord Wrentham come visit us again? No, darling. She kissed the top of his head. I don't think so. Why not? Did we do something wrong? No, my love. You did everything right. He has his own life, his own responsibilities. We can't expect him to keep visiting us. Oh, Theo's disappointment was palpable. I liked him. I know, so did I. The words slipped out before she could stop them. Theo looked up at her, his eyes too wise for 8 years old. Are you sad, Mama? A little. She forced a smile. But I'll be well. We'll have a lovely Christmas tomorrow, just the three of us. Will it be lonely? No. She pulled him close. How could it be lonely when I have you and Lottie? But as she said it, she knew it was a lie. The house would be lonely. The day would be lonely. Every day after would be lonely, now that she knew what it felt like to have Gabriel Sterling look at her as if she were the most important person in his world. After the service, neighbors wished them happy Christmas. Mrs. Pemberton smiled too brightly and asked if they'd enjoyed the concert. The subtext was clear. Everyone had seen Gabriel's attention. Everyone was wondering what would come of it. Now there would be nothing. The gossip would die down. Life would return to its quiet, gray routine. Meg walked home through the darkening streets, a child on each hand, and told herself this was enough. Her children were safe. They had a roof over their heads. Eleanor's threat had been neutralized. She'd made the right choice. Later, alone in her room after the children were asleep, she stood at the window and watched snow begin to fall, soft, silent flakes drifting through the lamplight. Somewhere across London, Gabriel was in his grand house, probably relieved to have escaped a complicated entanglement, probably already forgetting her. No, that was Eleanor talking. Eleanor with her poison and her certainty that men like Gabriel didn't care for women like her. But he had cared. She'd seen it in his eyes, heard it in his voice when he'd said her name, and she'd sent him away anyway. No more foolish dreams, she whispered to the empty room. No more wanting what I cannot have. She turned from the window, from the snow and the distant lights, and climbed into bed. Tomorrow was Christmas. She would make it special for Theo and Lottie. She would smile and laugh and pretend her heart wasn't breaking. She would survive this, as she'd survived everything else. But as she closed her eyes, her last thought was of Gabriel's face when she'd asked him to leave. The hurt and confusion and desperate hope that she'd take it back. She hadn't. And now it was too late. Chapter 7. Snow had fallen all night, the kind that muffled sound and turned the city to pearl. Gabriel Sterling, Earl of Wrentham, stood at his window, one hand braced on the glass, and watched flakes drift past the rooftops. The world looked new, forgiven. He, however, felt precisely the same, except for the hollowness beneath his ribs. He'd spent the night replaying yesterday's scene, the way Margaret had stood in that parlor, her hands clenched at her sides, her voice breaking as she'd asked him to leave. The careful blankness in her expression that hadn't quite hidden the desperation beneath. This was a mistake. I should never have encouraged your attention. She hadn't meant it. He'd stake his life on that certainty. The woman who'd whispered his name in the nursery doorway, who'd looked at him with such unguarded hope, that woman hadn't changed in 3 days. Eleanor had changed her circumstances. He'd understood it the moment he'd seen those packed trunks in the hallway, the Holland-covered furniture. The sister-in-law positioned like a spider in her web, every word calculated to poison and trap. If you continue this association, you and the children will need to find other lodgings. Margaret had been protecting her children. That was all. She'd made the only choice a mother could make when threatened with homelessness 3 days before Christmas. But Eleanor had left for the country yesterday afternoon, and that changed everything. He told himself he would merely deliver gifts, proper gratitude, see if she'd meet his eyes, gauge whether he'd read the situation correctly. 5 minutes, perhaps 10, nothing more. He didn't believe his own lies for a moment. When he stepped outside, the cold hit like a benediction. The air smelled of smoke and snow, of quiet streets, and the faint ringing of distant church bells. His boots broke the untouched crust of white all the way to her door. The maid's eyes widened when she opened it. Clearly, she'd been told to expect no callers on Christmas morning. But she admitted him at once, perhaps reading something in his expression that brooked no refusal. The parlor was warm and golden with firelight, greenery twined along the mantel, and the faint scent of cinnamon clung to the air. For a man who'd spent years avoiding the holiday, the domestic brightness felt almost scandalous. When Meg entered, she stopped dead in the doorway. She wore a soft wool gown of winter blue and had a smear of flour at her wrist. Clearly, she'd been in the kitchen. Her face went pale, then flushed. Her lips parted as if to speak, but no sound came. "My lord," she finally managed, her voice barely above a whisper. He bowed. "Merry Christmas, Mrs. Winslow." She didn't move, didn't curtsy, just stood there staring at him as if he were a ghost or a miracle, or possibly both. Her eyes were bright with something that might have been tears. "You came," she said. "I came. But yesterday, I told you." Her hands twisted in her skirts. Eleanor said. "Eleanor is in Kent," he said quietly. "Isn't she?" Understanding dawned across her face, followed swiftly by something that looked like hope struggling against practiced caution. "Yes, they left yesterday afternoon." "I know." He took a careful step closer, giving her space to retreat if she wished. She didn't. "I understood what happened yesterday, Meg, what you were forced to say, what you were protecting." Her breath caught. "You understood? A woman doesn't look at a man the way you looked at me in my music room, then send him away 3 days later unless someone's holding a knife to her throat." His voice gentled. "Eleanor threatened to turn you out, didn't she?" Meg's composure crumbled. She said, "If I continued the association, the children and I would need to find other lodgings." She said scandal would reflect on William's household. She said, her voice broke, "She gave me no choice." "I know." 2 words, but they held all the understanding she'd been desperate for. "I know, and I don't blame you. Not for a moment. But I sent you away." A tear slipped down her cheek. "I stood there and told you it was a mistake, and you looked so—" She couldn't finish. "I looked hurt," he supplied gently. "I was hurt. But I wasn't angry, Meg. I was furious with Eleanor, yes, but not with you. Never with you." She pressed trembling fingers to her mouth. "Then why did you come? Eleanor returns after 12th night. Nothing has changed. If you call on me, if someone sees, she'll make good on her threat. Then we'll be careful." He said it with such calm certainty that she blinked. "We'll be discreet. I'll come when the neighborhood isn't watching. We'll find a way, Meg. But I couldn't." He stopped, swallowed. "I couldn't stay away. Not on Christmas. Not when I knew you'd be here alone with the children, thinking I'd abandoned you." "I thought," her voice was thick, "I thought you'd decided Eleanor was right, that I wasn't worth the scandal." He closed the distance between them in 2 strides, taking her hands in his. "Look at me." When she did, he continued, "You are worth every scandal society can manufacture. You are worth fighting for, and I will not let Eleanor or anyone else take this from us. Do you understand?" She nodded, tears streaming freely now. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry for what I said yesterday. I didn't mean—" "I know." He brushed a tear from her cheek with his thumb. "You were protecting your children. I would never ask you to do otherwise. But Eleanor is gone for 12 days. 12 days, Meg. Let me give you Christmas. Please." She looked up at him. This man who'd walked through snow on Christmas morning because he couldn't bear to let her think herself abandoned. This man who'd seen through Eleanor's manipulations and come anyway. "You brought gifts," she said, spotting the parcels he'd set on the side table. "For the children." His mouth curved slightly. "I told myself that was why I came. It was a lie, of course." "Why did you come?" "Because I had nowhere else I'd rather be," he said simply. "And because the thought of you spending Christmas alone, believing I'd given up on you, I couldn't bear it." Fresh tears welled. "The children will be so happy to see you. Theo asked about you 3 times yesterday. I didn't know what to tell him." "Then let's not waste any more time explaining," Gabriel said. "Let me give you this day. We'll worry about Eleanor and society and everything else tomorrow. But today, just for today, let us have Christmas." She smiled through her tears. "You're terrifyingly single-minded." "Your son mentioned you don't smile enough," he said, thumb brushing across her knuckles. "I intend to remedy that." Before she could respond, the sound of thudding footsteps thundered down the stairs. "Mama, I heard voices. Is someone—" Theo burst into the room, then stopped dead. "Lord Wrentham." And just like that, the shadows of yesterday lifted. Theo burst into the room, hair wild, clutching a wooden soldier. "Mama, it's Lord Wrentham. Lottie, come quickly." Lottie appeared in the doorway, half hiding behind her doll. When Gabriel offered the small parcels, the boy tore his open, joy spilling out in a stream of words about wheels and harnesses and tiny painted horses. Lottie unwrapped hers more carefully, a fur muff trimmed in blue ribbon, and pressed it to her cheek with reverent delight. "Thank you," she whispered. Meg's voice was soft. "You spoil them, my lord." "Not nearly enough," he said. "May I?" He gestured toward the hearth, and she nodded. He knelt beside the children, listening to Theo's explanations of the coach's workings, helping Lottie adjust her ribbon. Their laughter filled the room, bright as bells. Once, she had thought him untouchable, polish and distance made into a man. Yet here he was on her threadbare rug, kneeling between a doll's ribbon and a toy coach, laughing with her children. The girl she had been would not have believed it. The woman she was did not quite know what to do with the warmth it sparked. When he stood again, his knees protested, and Meg smiled, genuinely this time. "You see," she said, "even you, my lord, aren't safe from toy horses and ribbons." He laughed, a low sound that surprised them both. Apparently not. He hesitated in the doorway, one hand still on the back of the chair he'd just vacated. The polite answer rose automatically. "No, I've already taken enough of your morning." But something in the warmth of the fire and the faint trace of cinnamon and pine held him fast. "If I wouldn't be in the way," he said. "You wouldn't," she replied too quickly, a touch of color rising in her cheeks. "I was about to slice the Christmas cake. It seems a shame to eat it alone." "Then I should hate to be the cause of such waste." He smiled as he resumed his seat. They ate in companionable quiet, the only sounds the tick of the clock and the faint clatter of the children overhead. Every so often he caught her studying him, as if trying to decide what to make of this man who had invaded her Christmas morning. She offered him another slice. He declined, and the brush of her fingers against his sleeve sent an unexpected current through him. Outside, the snow was thickening again. He watched it gathering on the sill, soft and unhurried. "It would be criminal," he said, "to waste weather like this." She looked up from the teapot. "Criminal? Absolutely. Hyde Park must look like a painting. Your children should be there, laughing, throwing snowballs, building kingdoms." He glanced toward the stairs. "We could walk them over. It's only a few streets." Her mouth parted in surprise, then curved, uncertain. "We?" He shrugged lightly. "You can't expect me to stand by while others make snow angels in my park." She laughed, the sound low and genuine. "You, my lord? Playing in the snow?" "Try me." Within moments, the household was in cheerful disarray. Boots hunted down, scarves wrapped, hats crookedly tied. When they stepped outside, the air bit at their cheeks, and the city seemed newly born under its blanket of white. The park lay hushed and shimmering. Theo dashed ahead, already forming the first snowball. Lottie toddled after him, leaving tiny footprints like lace. Gabriel crouched to help her shape a mound, his gloved hands deft and gentle. Meg stood back a moment, watching. He looked utterly unguarded, laughing when the snow collapsed beneath Lottie's small fist. She had never seen him laugh before, not truly. The sound loosened something in her chest she hadn't realized was tight. A sudden cold sting struck her shoulder. She gasped and turned. He was grinning, a snowball crumbling in his hand. "Oh, you shouldn't have done that?" she warned. "I'm sure I should." Her answering throw hit him squarely on the cravat. Lottie shrieked with delight. Theo whooped and declared it a battle. Soon they were all laughing, ducking, skidding, breathless in the glittering light. When at last they collapsed in a heap beside the path, peace settled over them like the falling flakes. Theo sprawled on his back, making angels. Lottie curled against her mother's knee. Gabriel brushed the snow from his coat and met Meg's eyes, still shining from laughter. "I've not fought a worthier foe," he said softly. "Nor I," she replied, smiling. They walked home slowly, the children running ahead, their scarves streaming like banners. Once his gloved hand brushed hers. Neither of them moved away. At her door, the warmth of the house spilling out around them, she turned to him. "Thank you, my lord, for all of this." He looked at her for a long moment. "You make it sound as though I gave you something." "You did," she said simply. "You gave us Christmas." His smile deepened, quiet and real. "Then I'll call it even," he said, and offered his arm as the children called from inside. Together they stepped through the doorway, leaving their footprints to fill with snow behind them. Gabriel had been selfish and unfair. By evening, it was obvious she'd had no plans beyond a quiet meal and her children's company, a small, peaceful day after years of making do, and he, uninvited, had upended it. He'd turned what should have been solitude into a shared day. He'd told himself it was kindness, but it was intrusion all the same. Yet somehow she hadn't sent him away. He stayed for Christmas dinner. He told himself each moment he'd rise to leave, and each time something stopped him. Her laughter, the warmth of the room, the way the candlelight turned her hair to copper and gold. He stayed when she poured coffee afterward, and when Theo begged to sing again, and when Lottie climbed onto his knee to show him the picture book she'd been given. Then Theo produced a new toy, a wooden spinning game sent by relatives, and asked, with a hopeful glance, whether the Earl of Wrentham might know how to play. He did not, but he learned. By late afternoon, he found himself stretched on the rug, head propped on one arm, while the boy sat cross-legged beside him, fiercely intent on every spin. Lottie had long since drifted to sleep, curled in her mother's lap, one small hand tangled in Meg's gown. The Yule log crackled softly. The scent of pine and cake and candle wax filled the room. Gabriel glanced toward the hearth and felt something unfamiliar press against his ribs, something perilously close to belonging. It was an achingly domestic scene. A family Christmas. Except they were not a family. And he had spent years avoiding this very thing. Meg rose at last to fetch the tea tray herself, determined, she said, to give the servants as much of the holiday as possible. He should have taken the cue, offered his thanks, and gone. Instead, he watched her move about the small kitchen with sleeves rolled and a stray curl loose against her cheek, and the thought of leaving felt oddly unbearable. When she returned, he offered to carry the tray back, but she shook her head. "You'll only spill it," she teased. So he contented himself with pouring, and somehow tea turned into cake again, and cake into laughter, and laughter into another hour. Theo chattered endlessly about his game, about the concert, about dragons and songs. Lottie woke long enough to climb back onto Gabriel's lap and with grave concentration unbutton every button down the front of his waistcoat, then button them again with equal care. Meg's horrified apology only made him laugh. "She's a born seamstress," he said lightly, and the child beamed, thumb in her mouth. But beneath the gentle noise and the warmth, a faint guilt pricked at him. He had stolen their day, her peace. The realization landed with quiet force. He looked across at her and smiled ruefully, but she only lowered her gaze to her cup, her expression unreadable. He could have left after tea, should have. Instead, he carried the tray to the kitchen himself, returned, and somehow found himself on the floor again, this time telling stories. Meg had been in the middle of one of her own, a tale spun with wit and wonder, her voice full of animation as the children hung on every word. When she paused, he found himself taking up the thread. "There was once," he began, "a dragon so terrible that his roar made the mountains shake. But he had one weakness, a princess in a white silk gown with lace frills and satin bows, and a prince disguised as a stagecoachman who blew a horn so loudly that the dragon's head rang for a week. The princess had a dress like my doll," Lottie said sleepily. "Did the horn really make him sick?" Theo asked, grinning. "Of course it did," Gabriel said solemnly. "He couldn't breathe fire for a whole month afterward, which gave the prince plenty of time to rescue the princess and to teach the dragon a very important lesson about eating people uninvited." Lottie giggled, half asleep. Theo groaned for another story. "Tomorrow," Meg said firmly, though her voice was warm. "It's long past bedtime." The protests were predictable but short-lived. Gabriel shook Theo's hand and solemnly kissed Lottie's tiny fingers before she was carried upstairs. Her wide eyes lingered on his face, full of some wordless emotion he didn't yet understand. "Good night, little one," he said softly. "Sleep well." When they were gone, silence settled. The fire had burned low, its light painting the room in gold and shadow. Gabriel stood at the mantel, one arm braced against it, staring into the flames. He should go. He'd overstayed every reasonable boundary. But the house smelled of pine and spice and warmth, and he could hear the faintest sound of her voice upstairs, soothing a child. He closed his eyes and tried not to think about how easily she had made him forget himself, or how entirely she'd changed the shape of his Christmas. Meg hesitated in the doorway. The fire had burned low, the air heavy with the scent of pine and candle wax. Gabriel stood before the hearth, one hand braced on the mantel, the other curved loosely at his side. His posture was the same calm elegance she'd come to recognize, yet his stillness felt taut, like a bow drawn to its limit. He turned when she stepped inside. The golden light caught his features, softening them, making him seem impossibly human. "I thought you might have gone," she said quietly. "I meant to." His voice was low, roughened by the firelight. "But I couldn't make myself walk out that door." Her pulse stumbled. "Why not?" He studied her a long moment, the silence stretching until her skin prickled. "Because the moment I do," he said, "the house will feel empty." Her breath hitched. The honesty of it undid her more than any practiced charm ever could. She crossed the room before she realized she'd moved. "You've been kind," she said, needing the words to sound ordinary. "You've given the children a day they'll remember forever." "And you?" he asked softly, her gaze lifted to his. "You've given me a day I never thought I'd have again." He took a step closer. The heat from the fire met the warmth of his body surrounding her. He smelled faintly of cedar and smoke and the cold air from outside. "Meg," he said. Her name was a caress. She should have stopped him. Instead, she whispered, "Gabriel." He reached out, fingertips brushing a curl from her cheek. The touch was hesitant, reverent, as if asking permission. Her skin tingled beneath his glove, every nerve alive. When his thumb grazed the corner of her mouth, she swayed toward him. The kiss began like an accident, slow, searching, a question neither dared to ask aloud. His lips were warm and certain. Hers parted before she could think. The world contracted to the rhythm of their breathing, to the rough wool of his coat beneath her fingers, to the dizzying heat that unfurled low in her belly. He deepened the kiss, and she met him with equal hunger, months, years of loneliness breaking open all at once. His hand slid to her back, anchoring her against him, and she felt the shudder that ran through his frame, the restraint it cost him not to draw her closer still. When he finally pulled away, both were trembling. "This shouldn't have happened," she whispered, though her fingers still clutched his sleeve. "Then tell me you're sorry," he murmured, his forehead resting against hers. She couldn't. "I can't." His laugh was soft, unsteady. "Neither can I." They stood there in the quiet, the fire popping softly, their breath mingling in the space between them. Outside, snow slid from the eaves in slow, heavy drifts. He brushed his knuckles along her jaw. "I don't want to hurt you, Meg. Not in any way." "You already have," she said. And when he drew back in alarm, she shook her head. "Because now I can't imagine this room without you in it." The confession hung there, fragile as glass. He kissed her again, gentler, lingering this time, sealing the truth between them. When he finally let her go, she was shaking. "I should go," he said hoarsely. "If I stay, I won't." She managed a nod, though her heart rebelled. "Then go, before I ask you not to." He took one step back, eyes dark with the knowledge that they were already past the point of no return. "Tomorrow," he said softly. "I'll come tomorrow." She didn't stop him. She couldn't. When the door closed behind him, she pressed her fingers to her lips, her breath unsteady. The taste of him lingered, smoke, winter, and something dangerously close to promise. This was no passing indulgence, no lonely widow's folly. It was the beginning of the trouble she'd feared and the hope she'd forgotten to want. Chapter 8. Dawn bled slowly through the frost on the panes, a pale wash of light that made the city look newly minted. Gabriel had not slept so much as listened, to the soft settle of his house, to the relentless tick of the clock, to the echo of a woman whispering his name against his mouth. He rose before the first coal was raked in the grates below. The mirror showed the same man he'd always been, neat, controlled, a line for a mouth that seldom remembered how to soften. Yet the room felt altered, as if some invisible door had opened and let winter air into a space gone stale. He crossed to the window and braced a hand on the cold sash. Yesterday, he had been content to be the Earl of Wrentham with a quiet house and a neat plan for solitude. Today, that felt like the memory of someone else's life. He could see a different morning as clearly as if it already existed. A woman in a blue wool gown, arguing gently about whether scones wanted more nutmeg, a boy humming a carol while polishing a toy coach, a little girl climbing onto his knee and solemnly buttoning every button of his waistcoat. He could see it, and God help him, he wanted it. Love, he decided, was not a declaration. It was certainty. One did not say it, one made it true. And if he meant to ask a woman like Meg Winslow to trust him with her future, he would not arrive with pretty speeches and empty hands. He would arrive with the future in place. He rang for his secretary and sent him out at once with instructions to find a house. Near Hyde Park, he said. Not too grand, cheerful, with light in the mornings. A small garden, enough rooms for a music room and a nursery that did not echo. He could hear himself, brisk and sure, and felt ridiculously like a man buying happiness by the yard. But he ignored the unease that thought carried. He knew what he was doing. He was building a life that could be lived. At 10, he went out himself. The air was brittle, the snow thinning to hard crusts along the edges of the road. He called first at Reverend Baker's, the vicar so delighted to see appear on his threshold that he nearly forgot his slippers. Gabriel settled him in his chair and explained, as calmly as one might arrange a subscription, what he intended. A donation for the roof, of course, quietly, in Mrs. Winslow's name. The vicar beamed, protested, beamed again, and the boy, Theo, had a voice that could not be left to perish whim. Gabriel produced a letter he'd drafted before breakfast to the choirmaster at the Abbey, and a second letter to accompany the first, in which a sum sufficient to cover fees and incidentals was promised for the boy's training. The vicar dabbed at his eyes. "Such generosity, my lord! The boy will have every advantage. Discretion, Reverend." Gabriel's tone was firm but not unkind. "Mrs. Winslow is a proud woman. She must believe the opportunity comes on her son's merit alone." Of course. The vicar nodded eagerly. "And the, personal matter?" Gabriel hesitated only a moment. The word marriage felt too large to say aloud without a witness he trusted, but the certainty of it pressed against his ribs like something living. "I intend to make everything proper. If you would be so kind as to arrange for the banns to be posted." "Tomorrow!" Reverend Baker cried, already half risen. "Oh, my lord, what joyous news! Mrs. Winslow will be—" "She will be told when the time is right," Gabriel interrupted, more sharply than he intended. "The banns are a formality, Reverend, a legal requirement. I will speak to her myself once everything is arranged." The vicar's enthusiasm dimmed slightly, confusion flickering across his features. "But surely, my lord, the lady should be consulted before. Mrs. Winslow has quite enough to worry about without adding wedding preparations to her burden." Gabriel stood, signaling the end of the discussion. "I am lightening that load, not adding to it. You may post the banns on Sunday." "Yes, my lord." The vicar's voice was uncertain now, but he bowed. "As you wish." Gabriel left feeling satisfied. One more piece in place, one more certainty secured. By noon he had called upon an agent and was touring townhouses. The first two were unsuitable. One reeked of new paint, another was damp as a cellar. But the third stopped him cold. It stood on a quiet square facing the park, modest by his standards but full of light. The moment he crossed the threshold, he could smell beeswax and hearth smoke and, absurdly, possibility. There was a parlor that would suit a pianoforte, a sunny breakfast room that opened onto a small garden, and upstairs, 3 chambers with connecting doors that made him think, unbidden, of laughter in the mornings, of a woman brushing snow from her daughter's curls. "It will need a little polish, my lord," the agent said nervously, following close behind. Gabriel smiled faintly. "So do we all." He signed the lease on the spot, then spent the next hour composing letters to his solicitor. Instructions to furnish the residence, arrangements for an account in Meg's name, a small trust for the children's future. Each signature felt like a promise kept, a future secured. By mid-afternoon, he was back at Wrentham House, his desk littered with papers and plans. Mrs. Trent appeared in the doorway, clearly astonished to see her usually fastidious master in such productive disarray. "Is something amiss, my lord?" He looked up, still smiling faintly. "Quite the opposite. There are to be some changes." Her eyebrows rose. "Indeed. A family will be joining me." The words came easily now, natural as breathing. "I'll need additional staff for the new residence, nursemaid, cook, housekeeper." He paused, his tone softening. "And if we can find someone who can bake gingerbread as well as you, Mrs. Trent, I shall consider myself fortunate." The housekeeper blinked in surprise. then curtsied. "Very good, my lord." When she left, Gabriel leaned back in his chair and surveyed the organized chaos before him. Letters drafted, arrangements made, the house secured, Theo's future at the Abbey, the banns posted. Within a week, he could present Meg with not just a proposal but a solution, a complete answer to every worry that kept her awake at night. She wouldn't have to wonder if he was serious, wouldn't have to fear Eleanor's threats or society's judgment. He would hand her the keys to a house that was already hers, show her the trust fund that would secure her children's futures, present her with Theo's acceptance to the Abbey choir. No uncertainty, no risk, just certainty, carefully constructed and thoroughly secured. He glanced at the clock. 3:30. He could call on her now, keep his promise from yesterday. Tomorrow, he'd said. "I'll come tomorrow." His hand moved toward his coat, then stilled. What would he tell her? That he loved her? She likely knew that already, after yesterday's kiss. That he wanted to marry her? She would ask questions, reasonable questions about how they would manage, where they would live, what would become of her children, and he would have to answer with intentions instead of certainties, with promises instead of proof. No. Better to wait. One more day, 2 at most, and he could present her with everything complete. Not a plea, but a plan. Not a request, but a gift. Tomorrow, he told himself. Tomorrow, when everything is ready. He turned back to his desk and pulled another sheet of paper toward him. There was still so much to arrange. Staff to hire, furniture to order, details to perfect. He would not come to her half-prepared, would not ask her to take a leap of faith when he could build her a bridge instead. She deserved certainty. After everything she'd endured, widowhood, poverty, Eleanor's cruelty, she deserved to know that someone had thought of everything, had anticipated every need, had secured every possible future. By late afternoon, the snow had begun to slide from the eaves in dull, heavy falls. Gabriel stood at his window and looked out across streets that felt unrecognizable because he, standing in them, was unrecognizable to himself. Somewhere across London, Meg was likely wondering why he hadn't come. The thought pricked at him. Uncomfortable, unwelcome. But she would understand. Once she saw what he'd built for her, once she understood the scope of what he was offering, she would see that the wait had been worth it. Promises were wind, he told himself firmly. Certainties were shelter. And he would not offer her anything less than absolute certainty. He turned from the window, called for Mrs. Trent to arrange dinner, and returned to his desk. There were more letters to write, more arrangements to make. The house needed furniture. The solicitor required additional instructions. The staff must be interviewed and hired. One more day, perhaps 2. Then he would go to her with everything complete, the house, the funds, the future. Then he would ask her to marry him, and she would see that he had thought of everything. He did not think how a day without a knock could look very much like neglect. He did not notice the hour closing around him like a fist, or how easily good intentions could calcify into control. He saw only a house with morning light and a woman opening the door to let him in, grateful, relieved, finally free of every burden he'd worked so hard to lift. Tomorrow, he told himself again, tomorrow he would make her happy. Chapter 9. The day began with the sound of Theo's voice, soft at first, then stronger, a thread of melody stitched through the stairwell. Meg woke smiling before she remembered why she did not dare to smile. She lay still for a breath, feeling the warm ache of yesterday in her chest, and then sat up too quickly, scolding herself for behaving like a girl with flowers in her head. She told herself she expected nothing. That lie made dressing easier. Downstairs, the parlor was a little untidy in the best way. Ribbons from Lottie's doll trailing over the arm of a chair, Theo's spinning game on the hearth rug, the tea tray where it had been left the night before, because she'd been too full of feeling to worry about silver. She straightened as she went, telling herself it was habit, not anticipation, that made her set out the good cups. She ordered scones to be warmed because it was cold and rainy. She asked for the preserves because children were always hungry. When Lottie came in with a face still pillow-creased, Meg scooped her up and kissed a cheek that smelled of sleep. "We shall have a sensible day," she told her daughter. "Reading. Perhaps a walk. Will Lord Wrentham come?" Lottie asked, thumb already drifting toward her mouth. Meg's heart performed a small, humiliating tumble. Gentlemen of rank are very busy after Christmas, she said lightly. We will not expect him. But she put a second place on the tray anyway. Not expecting was not the same thing as not preparing. She could not bear the thought of him standing there and her without a teacup in arm's reach. The thought of caring so much about a teacup made her want to laugh and cry in the same breath. By noon, the sky had gone the color of dirty paper. She took the children out because fresh air was not an emotion and would not betray her. The streets were slushy and full of men with brooms and women with baskets. Lottie insisted on stepping in every puddle, and Theo insisted on narrating the battle of yesterday's snow as if it had been Trafalgar. He'll come again, he said with the serene faith of 8. He promised to see my coach. Meg tucked her scarf closer beneath her chin. We do not hold gentlemen to promises made when they are warm by a fire, she said. It came out wryer than she intended. She wished for a moment that she could take the words and polish them into something kinder, but honesty had always been her particular vice. They turned back when Lottie's cheeks had gone chapped and Theo's nose was red. At the door, Meg looked, carelessly, deliberately, up the street and down, as if admiring the weather. No carriage. The thought made a small, traitorous dent in her resolve. After dinner, she read from the book Lottie had been given by her aunt and uncle, and when Lottie's head began to weight itself against her shoulder, Meg set the book aside and told the story the way Gabriel had told it. The dragon with the vibrating skull, the coachman with the magic horn, the princess in a gown like a doll. She could hear his voice as she spoke. Calm and amused, too clever for children and yet exactly right for them, and the sound of it in her head made her throat thick. Will he come again, Mama? Theo asked, already half asleep. Of course, she said, smoothing his hair back from his forehead. Men who love music always come back to it. The lie was so pretty she almost believed it. Night came early. The kindling the maid had left laid itself down and refused to catch. Meg knelt and coaxed a flame into being because she had decided, without admitting it, that she would not permit the room to be cold if he came. It was absurd, this business of warmth and cups and glances out windows, and she told herself so 10 times. The 11th time she did not tell herself anything at all. When the children were settled and the house had gone to its small, familiar sounds, she carried the tea tray back to the kitchen because she could not bear the sight of it set for someone who had not come. She found herself wiping at a spot on the silver that had not existed until she invented it. A neighbor knocked, bringing a tin of biscuits, and in the doorway, in that friendly, thoughtless way of people who do not know they are holding knives, said, I'm sure I saw Lord Wrentham's carriage on Brook Street this morning. He must be back to his grand parties at last, hey? Meg smiled so well, even she almost admired it. I expect so, she said. Merry Christmas. When the door had closed, she went to the window and stood without moving. Across the way, a lamp guttered in a draught, and then steadied. Snow, finer now, half rain, sparked in the gaslight like dust in a sunbeam. She pressed her knuckles lightly to her lips and took one breath, then another, until she could no longer feel the urge to do anything so foolish as cry. It had been a beautiful day. That was the truth. He had given that to her and to her children. And now she would pay for it with the ache that follows beauty, which was the fee life always charged. Upstairs, a board creaked in the nursery. She could hear the tiny thump of Lottie turning over. In the quiet below, Meg set another log on the fire and watched the flame take. The room smelled faintly of pine and warm bread. The good teacups waited where she had put them away. She had thought she had forgotten how to hope. She stood there until the clock chimed the hour and learned, to her cost, that she had remembered, and hoping was a very dangerous thing. Chapter 10. The furniture arrived on the second morning, great carts rumbling up to the Hanover Square house, men shouting directions as they maneuvered a rosewood pianoforte through the doorway. Gabriel stood in the empty drawing room and watched it take shape around him. Chairs upholstered in soft blue, a sofa deep enough for children to burrow into, curtains that would let in light without sacrificing warmth. He ran his hand along the pianoforte's polished surface and heard, unbidden, the echo of Theo's clear voice filling his music room. The boy would love this instrument. And Meg, he could see her here, seated at the keys, her face softened by concentration as her fingers found the melody she'd once played before poverty had taken even that small joy from her. "My lord?" The agent hovered at his elbow, catalog still in hand. "The nursery pieces will arrive this afternoon. Shall I have them placed according to your specifications?" "Yes, exactly as I outlined." Gabriel turned from the pianoforte. "And the painting I requested for the breakfast room?" "Should be delivered by week's end, my lord." "Good." The painting showed a pastoral scene, rolling hills, a winding stream, the sort of peaceful landscape a woman might look at over morning tea and feel for a moment that the world was kind. He'd spent an hour selecting it, imagining her there. "His lordship is very thorough," the agent ventured, clearly curious about this sudden domestic transformation. "His lordship intends everything to be perfect," Gabriel replied and dismissed him. Perfect. The word followed him through empty rooms, through measurements and fabric samples, and the careful placement of every chair. This was what love looked like when rendered into action. Not poetry, but provision. Not romance, but certainty made tangible. He should go to her. The thought surfaced a dozen times that day, each time met with the same deflection. Not yet. Not until it's finished. By evening, Mrs. Trent found him in the breakfast room, staring at bare walls and mentally placing artwork that hadn't yet arrived. "My lord," she began, her tone careful, "forgive me, but have you given thought to when you'll be informing Mrs. Winslow of these arrangements? When everything is complete? And when might that be?" Gabriel turned to face her. His housekeeper's expression held that particular blend of concern and exasperation she reserved for moments when she thought him being foolish. "Soon. Another day or two at most. It's been 2 days already, my lord, since Christmas. I'm aware." "Are you?" She folded her arms, a liberty she'd earned through 20 years of service. "Because Mrs. Winslow is not." The words landed with uncomfortable precision. "She knows I have obligations, business to attend to. She knows you kissed her on Christmas Day and then vanished." Mrs. Trent's voice was gentle but unyielding. "Whatever your intentions, my lord, she cannot read your mind. And women in her position, they have reason to fear what silence means." Gabriel's jaw tightened. "I'm not abandoning her. I'm building her a home." "Without asking if she wants it?" "Of course she wants it. She lives on her brother-in-law's charity in 3 rooms that aren't hers. She wears frayed lace and worries about coal. Why wouldn't she want?" He stopped, hearing the edge in his own voice. Mrs. Trent waited, patient as stone. "This is a gift," he said finally, more quietly. "Everything I'm doing is for her, for them. Then perhaps you might tell her so, before she assumes the worst." Mrs. Trent curtsied and withdrew, leaving him alone with his perfect plans and the uncomfortable suspicion that she might be right. But he pushed the doubt aside. One more day. The nursery furniture would be arranged tomorrow, the staff interviews completed. He'd present everything at once, whole and complete, leaving no room for her to worry or doubt. She would understand. She had to. The 3rd morning brought Simon Bancroft to his door, uninvited and annoyingly perceptive. "Good God," Simon said, surveying the chaos of Gabriel's study. Correspondence scattered across every surface, lists in 3 different hands, a half-eaten breakfast gone cold on the side table. "Have you slept?" "I've been busy." Clearly. Simon moved a stack of upholstery samples from a chair and sat. "The rumor mill suggests you've leased a house in Hanover Square and ordered enough furniture to outfit a small palace. Care to explain?" Gabriel didn't look up from the letter he was drafting to the nursery staff agency. "It's a private matter. Private matters don't usually require 3 furniture deliveries in as many days." Simon leaned back, studying him with that infuriating aristocratic ease. "This is about the widow, isn't it, Mrs. Winslow?" "Her name is Margaret." "Ah, so it is serious." Simon's expression softened slightly. "Have you spoken to her about any of this?" "I will, when everything is ready." "When everything is, Gabriel, have you lost your mind?" Simon sat forward, his casual demeanor dropping away. "You can't simply arrange a woman's entire life without consulting her. That's not generosity. It's certainty." Gabriel set down his pen with controlled force. She spent 4 years living on scraps and charity, never knowing if tomorrow would bring security or destitution. I'm giving her both, a home of her own, funds in her name, her son's future secured. How is that anything but kindness? It's control dressed up as devotion. Simon's voice was quiet but firm. And if she has any spirit at all, which I suspect she does, or you wouldn't be so besotted, she'll resent being treated like a problem to be solved, rather than a woman to be courted. You don't understand. Don't I? Simon stood, moving to the window. I've watched you manage estates, investments, every detail of your life with the same meticulous precision. It's served you well in business, but Margaret Winslow is not a business transaction. She's a woman who's already been powerless once. Do you really think she'll thank you for taking away her choice again? Gabriel stared at his lists, his carefully itemized plans. I'm giving her choices, more choices than she's had in years. No, you're giving her conclusions. Simon turned back to face him. The choice would have been asking what she wanted before you arranged it. This is you deciding what's best and expecting gratitude. You think I should stop, undo everything? I think you should talk to her, today, before you spend another shilling or sign another document. Simon's expression turned sympathetic. I know you mean well, but good intentions without communication are just another form of abandonment. And she's been abandoned enough, hasn't she? After Simon left, Gabriel sat alone in his study. The morning light had shifted, throwing his shadow long across the floor. He looked at his lists, his plans, the tangible proof of his devotion rendered into furniture and funds and futures secured. Was Simon right? Was this control masquerading as care? No, it couldn't be. Everything he'd done had been for her, for them. He was giving her security, removing every obstacle that stood between them and happiness. How could that be wrong? But Mrs. Trent's words echoed alongside Simon's. She cannot read your mind. Women in her position have reason to fear what silence means. He pulled out a fresh sheet of paper, intending to write to her, to explain, to bridge the silence. His pen hovered over the blank page. What could he say? I've been arranging your life without asking because I love you? That sounded even worse when put to paper. He set the pen down. No, better to wait one more day. Tomorrow the Abbey letter would arrive. He was certain of it. Tomorrow he could present everything at once. The house, the funds, Theo's future. Proof that his silence had been purpose, not neglect. Tomorrow she would understand. He crumpled the blank page and returned to his lists. The letter arrived Thursday morning, delivered with the regular post, as if it were ordinary correspondence, rather than the final piece of his carefully constructed future. Gabriel broke the seal with hands that trembled. Ridiculous to be nervous about a letter, and read, My Lord Wrentham, your recommendation of young Master Theodore Winslow has been received with great interest. I had the pleasure of hearing the boy sing at your Christmas concert, and I must concur with your assessment of his extraordinary talent. We are pleased to offer him a place in our choir program to commence with the spring term. His training will include musical theory, composition, and performance, with the opportunity to sing for some of the finest audiences in England. Gabriel's whoop of triumph echoed through the hall. Mrs. Trent appeared in the doorway, her hand pressed to her chest. My lord, is something amiss? Everything is perfect. He crossed the study in 3 strides, waving the letter. The Abbey, they've accepted Theo. He'll have the finest musical education in England. How wonderful. Mrs. Trent's smile was genuine but cautious. I'm sure his mother will be delighted. His mother, Meg, who didn't yet know. Gabriel's elation dimmed slightly. I'll tell her today, this afternoon. I'll go to her with... He gestured at his study, at the accumulated evidence of 4 days' work. With everything. The house is furnished, the staff hired, Theo's future secured. Everything I promised myself I'd have ready before I asked her. Asked her what, my lord? To marry me. The words came easily now, no longer too large to speak aloud. To let me give her and her children the life they deserve. Mrs. Trent was quiet for a long moment. And if she says no, the question caught him off guard. Why would she say no? I'm offering her everything, security, opportunity, a home of her own. Why would any rational person refuse that? Perhaps because she wasn't asked if she wanted it. Mrs. Trent's voice was gentle. Perhaps because 4 days of silence after a kiss might look less like devotion and more like regret. I haven't. Gabriel stopped, took a breath. She'll understand when I explain. I hope so, my lord. But Mrs. Trent's expression suggested she had her doubts. After she left, Gabriel stood in his study surrounded by proof of his planning. Letters confirming staff, lease agreements, the Abbey's acceptance, keys to a house filled with furniture chosen for a family that wasn't yet his. He should feel triumphant. He should feel ready. Instead, he felt the first cold whisper of doubt, but he pushed it away. He'd come too far to second-guess now. Everything was ready. Everything was perfect. He would go to her this afternoon, show her the house, present Theo's letter, explain about the banns. She would see what he'd built for her, this future he'd constructed with such care, and she would understand that his silence had been purpose, not abandonment. She would forgive him for the wait. She would say yes. She had to. Because if Simon and Mrs. Trent were right, if he'd mistaken control for devotion, if his certainty had blinded him to what she actually needed, then he'd spent 4 days building a prison disguised as a palace, and he'd be presenting her with the keys, expecting gratitude. Gabriel shook his head, dismissing the thought. No, he knew Meg, knew her circumstances, her worries, her fears. He'd solved them all, given her everything she needed to be free. That was love, wasn't it? He gathered the Abbey letter, the keys to the Hanover Square house, his carefully prepared speech. Checked the time, 2:30. Perfect. He'd arrive by 3, spend the afternoon showing her everything, explaining it all. By evening, they'd be engaged. By Sunday, when the banns were read for the first time, she'd be standing beside him, proud and certain, and finally free of every burden that had weighed her down. He called for his carriage, his heart light with anticipation. He didn't know that across London, Meg had just broken the seal on a letter from Reverend Baker. He didn't know that the vicar's well-meaning announcement of their banns would land like a bomb. He didn't know that the woman he was racing to surprise with his perfect plans had just learned he'd arranged their marriage without asking her first. He only knew that everything was ready, and that he couldn't wait another moment to see her face when he gave her everything she'd ever needed. The carriage rolled through London's winter streets, and Gabriel Sterling smiled. Everything was ready. Everything was perfect. Finally, he could give her the future she deserved. Chapter 11. By Thursday, she had stopped setting out the second cup. The parlor felt smaller, without hope to fill it. Meg moved through the morning with the efficiency of someone who had outlived illusions before and knew the motions required to survive them. Breakfast. The children's lessons. Lottie's dollhouse, which had lost a shutter and required mending. Theo's arithmetic, which he performed with admirable focus while humming under his breath. Always humming, always that thread of melody that once would have made her think of Gabriel, but now only reminded her how foolish she had been. She did not look out the window, did not pause when carriages passed, did not invent reasons to tidy the parlor or check her hair in the glass above the mantel. 4 days. 4 days since he had kissed her by this very fire, since he had knelt on this rug with her children, since he had looked at her as if she were the answer to a question he hadn't known he was asking. 4 days of silence. She understood now. Eleanor had been right all along, not about Gabriel's character perhaps, but about the gulf between their worlds. An earl did not court a penniless widow. He indulged in a moment's sentimentality at Christmas, and then he returned to his proper life. The kiss had been beautiful. The day had been perfect. And now it was over, and she would survive it as she had survived everything else. "Mama?" Lottie appeared at her elbow, doll dangling from one hand. "Why did you move the soldier?" Meg glanced at the mantel. She'd turned the wooden toy to face inward sometime yesterday, unable to bear its painted gaze fixed on the window, waiting for something that would never come. "He was getting cold," she said. "Facing the fire keeps him warmer." Lottie accepted this with the sublime logic of 4 years old and wandered off to explain the new arrangement to her doll. Theo looked up from his slate, his eyes too knowing. "He's not coming back, is he?" The question was quiet, matter of fact. No accusation, just a boy learning one more lesson about how the world worked. Meg set down her mending. "I don't think so, darling. Did we do something wrong?" "No." She pulled him close. pressed a kiss to his hair. You did everything right. Sometimes. Sometimes people mean well, but their lives take them in different directions. Lord Wrentham has responsibilities, a household to manage. He was kind to visit us, but we cannot expect more than that. But he said, I know. Her throat tightened. But sometimes what people say and what they can do are different things. It doesn't mean he lied, only that circumstances changed. Theo nodded slowly, processing this with the same serious concentration he brought to everything. Like when Papa said he'd take me fishing. The comparison landed like a blow. Robert had made so many promises in those final months, small hopes offered from his sickbed, intentions he'd never had the strength to keep. Meg had watched her son learn gradually and painfully that love did not always translate into presence. She would not let Gabriel become another lesson in abandonment. Yes, she said quietly. Like that, Papa wanted to take you fishing. Lord Wrentham wanted to visit again, but wanting and doing are not always the same thing. I understand, but the slump of his shoulders said he understood too well. After lunch, she sent the children to play upstairs and sat alone in the parlor, staring at the hearth where she'd been foolish enough to let him kiss her. The fire had burned down to embers. She should add coal, should tend to it, but the cold felt appropriate somehow. Fitting. She had been a widow for 4 years. She knew how to be alone, knew how to fill days with small tasks and smaller hopes, how to make a life from the margins of someone else's charity. She had been doing it successfully until Gabriel Sterling had stopped on Bond Street to listen to Theo sing, and now she would return to it. The quiet life, the careful invisibility, the endless work of being grateful for scraps. At least Eleanor would be pleased. The thought carried a bitter satisfaction. Her sister-in-law had been right about everything, the impropriety, the scandal, the inevitable disappointment. Meg had ignored her warnings, had let herself believe in something impossible, and now she would pay for it with 4 days of waiting and the hollow ache of hope abandoned. She pressed her fingers to her temples, fighting the headache that had been building since morning. Tonight she would sleep. Tomorrow she would begin the work of forgetting. She was good at that. She'd had practice. The clock chimed 3, then 4. The winter light began its early fade toward evening, turning the room gray and indistinct. Meg rose and lit the lamps, more from habit than need. Drew the curtains, checked on the children, who were playing some elaborate game involving the wooden soldier, Lottie's doll, and a kingdom made of cushions. Their laughter drifted down the stairs, bright and unconcerned, and she was grateful they had already begun to forget. She returned to the parlor and stood for a moment, looking at the room that 4 days ago had felt transformed by his presence. Now it was just a room again. Worn furniture, faded curtains, the borrowed space of a borrowed life. She should be relieved, should be grateful the fantasy had ended before it could do real damage, before the gossip could spread, before her children could become more attached to a man who would never be theirs. Instead, she felt only the emptiness where hope had been, and the dull ache of learning, again, that she was not the sort of woman men fought to keep. The post fell through the slot just then with the small clatter specific to folded paper and braided string. Meg startled, then stood. Habit made her wait. One breath, too, as if news could fold itself into something kinder if she did not rush. She went to the hall, lifted the letters from the mat, and turned them over in her hands. The topmost was addressed in the vicar's neat, careful hand. Mrs. Winslow, in ink that liked to blot. She broke the seal with her thumb. My dear Mrs. Winslow, I write with the happiest tidings. You will be pleased, I am sure, to hear that the banns of marriage between yourself and the Earl of Wrentham shall be published this coming Sunday, and twice thereafter, in accordance with the law. I rejoice to be an instrument of Providence in uniting two such worthy persons, and remain. The words tumbled and tripped, a cheerful cascade, the sort of pastoral effusion she had endured 100 times. She had to read them twice before they clicked into meaning, and a third time before meaning turned to heat. She looked up as if the ceiling would offer witness, and then read the line about rejoice again because her hands had begun to shake and reading steadied them. The letter slid, soft as cloth, to the hall table. She laid her palms down flat on either side of it, and felt the steadiness of wood. Her first thought, absurd, was that she had been foolish about the teacups. Her second was that she had been even more foolish about the man. She was very quiet for a long moment. The house held its breath with her. Somewhere above, the floorboard in the nursery creaked the way it always did when Lottie rolled onto her back. The clock in the parlor announced the quarter in the voice of a polite tyrant. Meg lifted the letter again and read to the end, because she was not a coward, and because facts, however wretched, were easier to bear when plainly seen. The vicar rejoiced. The city would gossip. Strangers would decide what had happened in her rooms and with her children and to her life. And the man who had stood by her fire and kissed her as if he knew what restraint cost had gone the next day to decide for her, without asking. Something very old in her, something she had mistaken for gentleness, sat down and folded its hands. Something else, something she had not allowed to stand in years, rose instead, tall and furious and very still. She took the letter into the parlor and placed it on the mantel beside the soldier, where she could see it each time she looked up. The fire burned clear and low, a steady flame. She sat, folded her hands in her lap, and waited for the knock she knew would come now. It did not matter whether he arrived with flowers or papers or explanations. She had learned, in a life that had offered too many lessons, that there were times one must teach people how to treat you. It was wearying work. It was necessary work. When the bell rang at last, late afternoon or early evening, the light had gone sullen and one could not tell, she did not start. She rose with care, smoothed her skirts, and walked to the door with the grace the world mistook for meekness. She was not meek. She opened the door to a man she had once thought the loneliest person in London. He looked very pleased with himself. "Meg," he said, all warmth, all promise. "I've something to show you." "So have I," she replied, and her voice was lovely and cold as the silver on her tray. Chapter 12. Gabriel set the portfolio on the little table and tugged off his gloves, aware in some remote corner of his mind how boyish he must look, damp from the snow, shining with satisfaction. He spread the papers the way one might lay out gifts for a child, careful not to smudge. "There's a house," he began, and then, because the sentence felt inadequate for what he had done, "No, not a house, a home, Hanover Square, light in every room, a small garden, quiet enough to hear birds in the morning. I thought of Theo at the window seat. He can see the park from there, and Lottie will make kingdoms out of that patch of lawn. There's a parlor for music. The pianoforte is serviceable. It will sing once a tuner has had it." She did not move closer. Her hands were folded lightly, knuckles paling and unpaling with each slow breath. "I have written to the choirmaster at the Abbey," he went on, encouraged by the sound of plans spoken aloud. "There's a place for Theo when you wish. He can begin with a tutor at once, discreet, steady, no nonsense. And your name," he tapped the lease, "is already on the agreement. The house will be aired and ready within the week. I told Mrs. Trent about gingerbread." He could not help it, he laughed. "She said she would find a woman who bakes like an angel." "Gingerbread," Meg said, as if tasting the word. "And," he said more quietly, turning the final paper so that the seal caught the light, "I have spoken to Reverend Baker." Ah, she did not look at the paper. Her gaze had landed on some point just beyond his shoulder. The vicar. Yes, he felt that odd lightness again, the relief of a thing decided for good. "I have asked him to post the banns on Sunday." Silence opened like a door onto a dark stair. The coal shifted in the grate with a soft hiss. Somewhere, a floorboard yielded to the weight of the house settling. He had time to think, absurdly, that this was how quiet Wrentham Park had sounded at dawn as a boy, just before the dogs woke and shattered everything. "Without asking me," she said, "but surely you knew I intended." Intended, not asked. He reached for sense and found only intent. "I meant to spare you trouble, to spare us both the indignity of common talk, to make things certain." Her attention drifted to the mantel. Not the fire, but the edge of it, where a single letter lay beside a small painted soldier. She did not pick it up. She did not need to. "You took care," she said evenly, "of my son's schooling, a house, a wedding, all in 2 days." Her eyes returned to his. "You did not knock at my door once." He felt heat rise in his face. Ridiculous, humiliating. I wanted to come with proof, not promises. You came with papers, she said, and called them love. The phrase struck, clean as a blade slipped between ribs. Reflex made him reach for her hands. She stepped back in the same instant. A small movement, no more than the width of her own palm, but it rocked him. He stopped, fingers closing on nothing. Meg, he tried again, I have no wish to command you. God help me, I only wanted you safe. I have learned to be safe, she said. It is a smaller thing than happiness, but it is mine. It is mine because I decide, and I do not wake to find myself arranged. Arranged. The word landed with the weight of habit and years. He saw suddenly, too late, what she was truly looking at when she looked at the papers. Not generosity, but a hand closing around the wrist of her life and steering it elsewhere. Listen, he said, desperate to untangle what he had done, desperate to make her see the picture as he saw it. He swallowed. I have never cared enough to make mistakes. That is the truth of me. This, he gestured helplessly to the table. This is clumsy, but it is the way I know to build a thing that lasts. I cannot bear the thought of you counting coins for coal or telling Theo no because a tutor costs what you haven't got. I cannot bear the thought of you thinking love is the same as fear. I wanted to lay down the fear. And in its place, she said softly, set me inside your certainty. She smiled then, though it was not a smile at all, more the memory of one. You intend kindness, Gabriel. You make a very fine prison of it. He heard the name as if she had touched him. He had not known until that moment that she had withheld it on purpose in recent days, the intimacy of it a coin she chose when to spend. He wanted to seize on that and say, I will learn, then, teach me. I will destroy every bar of any prison you find, but the words felt like more arranging. Tell me what to do, he said instead, and knew as he said it that he had never asked anyone that with his whole heart. Leave, she said. He stared at her as if she had spoken in a language he had once known and then forgotten. You are angry now. When you see the house, do not finish that sentence. The steel in her voice was quiet and absolute. Do not try to sell me a dream that does not ask me whether I wish to be asleep. He felt something in him give, the faint tear of cloth that has been under strain too long. He looked down at the scatter of documents, the proof of his good intentions. They lay there like a map stolen from the person who had to walk it. I thought, he said, and he could not keep the wretchedness from his voice, I was doing the right thing. So did my husband, she said, and it was the first time she had put the word between them like a thing on a table, not to be pitied but examined. He dressed his choices in care and called it love. It took me years to understand why I could not breathe. I am not that man. Then be not like him, she said. Ask me. Wait for my answer. Trust that I have one. If she had shouted, he might have shouted back. If she had struck, he might have borne it and begged. The composure, the composure, undid him. He understood then that this was what power felt like when it was not his, a woman standing before him, tired and unafraid, refusing to let him make her smaller so that he could feel large. He wanted to drop where he stood and hold fast to the hem of her gown and promise anything. Some instinct older than pride made him straighten instead. He gathered the papers mechanically, aligning edges that no longer seemed to belong to any future he wanted. The vicar's letter slid a fraction beneath his hand. He left it where it lay. I never meant to hurt you, he said. But you did, she answered with no triumph in it. And if I say yes now, the hurt will learn the way to our door. He nodded once, because anything more would have broken him. Good night, Mrs. Winslow. She flinched for the first time, and he hated himself for using the distance of her name to hide the ache in his. He tried again quietly. Good night, Meg. Good night, my lord, she said, and made it sound like a benediction and a dismissal both. He bowed, absurd, formal, grateful for the ritual of it, because ritual was something to hold. In the hall, the butler materialized without being seen to. Gabriel's coat was in his hands before Gabriel knew he had reached the threshold. The door opened on a wash of cold air and a world that looked exactly as it had when he walked in, which felt like a particular cruelty. He stepped out. The snow sounded again like sand hissing across stone. Behind him, the door closed with a soft finality that struck him somewhere beneath the sternum. He stood on the step an instant, head tipped back to the colorless sky, letting the flakes gather on his lashes until they melted and ran cold at his temples. When he began to walk, it was not toward Hanover Square. The portfolio hung heavy against his side, purposeless weight. The lamps along the street made small golden islands in the gray. He passed through them like a man crossing a river in winter, careful of his footing, numb, unwilling to look down. He had offered her everything. He had forgotten to offer her the freedom to want it. The thought arranged itself with terrible simplicity. He could not unknow it now. Each step made the sentence truer. At Brook Street, he stopped because he did not know what to do with his hands, and because stopping felt like penance. A costermonger, late to his dinner, rattled by with a barrow. A woman hurried past with her scarf pulled high, eyes on the ground. Ordinary life continued with the indifference of a tide. He had always loved the way London swallowed scandal and joy alike, masticating them into rumor and movable feast. Tonight, the city felt like a witness who would tell no one what it had seen. He turned at last toward home because there was nowhere else that would admit him. In his head, the room where she had stood replayed itself in exact detail. The letter on the mantel, the soldier guard to nothing, the clean edge of her voice when she spoke his name like a promise she would not break, even if it hurt her. At his door, he paused with his hand on the knocker, then let it fall without sound. He could not bear the racket of it. Inside, the marble hall echoed anyway. Mrs. Trent appeared from a shadow as if conjured, but whatever she saw in his face made her hold her questions. He was grateful for that mercy beyond reason. "In the morning," he said, and his voice sounded like someone else's, hoarse, tired, older. "I will send for my solicitor, and for the vicar." "Yes, my lord." He went to his study and laid the portfolio on the desk. He did not sit. He crossed to the window and put his palm against the cold glass. From here, the street lamps made neat little circles of light, islands in a gray sea. He imagined, for one mad, sharp instant, striking a match to the papers and letting the flame eat his certainties. But fire was an easy answer for men like him, dramatic, useless. He had done enough arranging for a lifetime in one day. "Ask her," he said aloud to the empty room, as if speaking the remedy could undo the harm. "Ask her, and if she says no." He could not finish the sentence. He stood there until the frost rhymed where his breath had touched the pane, and ran at last as water. Somewhere far off a bell struck the hour. He counted each chime and did not move. He had thought he knew loneliness. He had been wrong. Loneliness was not the absence of people. It was the knowledge that you had shut the door yourself. He let his hand fall, turned away from the window, and began the long work of undoing what he had done. Chapter 13. The fire had gone low, its light reduced to the faint pulse of coals, but Meg sat before it still, her hands clasped in her lap to keep them from shaking. The house was utterly silent, children asleep upstairs, servants tucked away with their own small comforts. The clock on the mantel ticked through the quiet like something alive. He was gone. She had watched him step out into the snow, the dark curve of his coat swallowed by the pale swirl of flakes. He hadn't looked back. She told herself she was glad. She had done the only thing she could, had defended her dignity, her freedom, the hard-won autonomy that no man, however kind, however well-meaning, had the right to rearrange without asking. Her throat ached, but not with tears, with fury that had nowhere left to go. He had come with such joy. She'd seen it in his eyes before he'd spoken, that boyish, hopeful certainty that he'd solved everything. And perhaps that was what hurt most. Not malice, but the breathtaking presumption that love could be built like a house, room by room, without ever asking if she wanted to live there. She rose and paced the small length of the rug. Every surface whispered of him, the chair he'd used, the faint scent of cedar and cold air, the portfolio he'd carried as if it were a bouquet. She had thought herself past this kind of ache. Widowhood had taught her to bury longing beneath practicalities, to survive on what remained when everything else was stripped away. But this wasn't longing for what she'd lost. It was grief for what he'd wasted. Because she had loved him. Still loved him, God help her. Loved the man who'd knelt on her rug with her children, who'd listened to Theo sing as if it were the only music that mattered, who'd kissed her by this fire and made her believe, for one dangerous, luminous moment, that she could be wanted for herself and not merely managed. But love without respect was just another cage with prettier bars. "You did the right thing," she whispered to the empty room. Not to convince herself, she knew she had, but to make it real, to hear it spoken aloud. A soft cry drifted from upstairs. Lottie, dreaming. Meg climbed the stairs and slipped into the nursery where both children slept tangled in blankets, the fire banked low. Theo's hand rested protectively on his sister's shoulder, even in sleep. She stood watching them, these two small lives she'd carried through widowhood and poverty and every indignity that came with being powerless. For their sake, she had learned to bend, to smile when she wanted to scream, to accept charity and call it kindness. But she would not teach them that love meant surrender. She smoothed a curl from Lottie's cheek, her hands steady now. "I did right by you," she whispered, "even if it hurts." When she returned to her room and closed the door, the anger had settled into something colder, clearer. She had been right to send him away. She would not apologize for that, not even to herself. But as she lay in the dark, listening to the house settle around her, one thought circled back with stubborn persistence. She wished he had asked. If he had come with questions instead of answers. If he had said, "What do you want?" instead of "Here is what I've built." If he had offered partnership instead of rescue. She would have said yes. The realization didn't change anything, but it sat with her through the long hours until dawn, a truth she couldn't unknow. She loved him still. And that was the cruelest part of all. Gabriel did not sleep. The fire in his study burned down to ash, but he didn't call for it to be rebuilt. The cold felt appropriate, fitting. He sat at his desk with the portfolio open before him, each document a monument to his own stupidity. The lease, signed and witnessed, the correspondence about furniture, staff, arrangements, the vicar's congratulations on the upcoming nuptials. All of it rendered meaningless by the look in her eyes when she'd said "you came with papers" and called them love. He'd thought he was building her a future. Instead, he'd built her a prison and expected gratitude for the craftsmanship. What a child he'd been. What an arrogant, presumptuous fool. He poured brandy and set it aside untouched. His mind replayed the scene with relentless precision. Her voice, calm and devastating. The way she'd stood with the fire behind her, every word a surgeon's cut. You make a very fine prison of it. She'd been right, about all of it. He'd told himself he was giving her choices, security, opportunity, freedom from want. But he'd never asked what she actually wanted, had never trusted her to know her own mind, to make her own decisions. He'd seen a problem and solved it the only way he knew how, with money and control and the certainty that he knew best. Possession was his inheritance. His father had taught him well. Claim, secure, control. Everything in its place, everyone in their role. Gabriel had spent years telling himself he'd escape that legacy. Tonight, he saw the truth. He'd only polished it into something that looked like devotion. He thought of her children. Theo's bright voice, Lottie's small hands buttoning his waistcoat with such grave concentration. He'd wanted them safe, but he'd also wanted them his. Wanted to be the one who gave them everything, who made their mother's eyes light with gratitude. He pressed his hands over his face. The truth was unbearable, but he forced himself to sit with it. He had not loved her freely. He had loved her the way a man loves a painting he means to buy. Admiring it, yes, but already planning where to hang it. At some dark hour before dawn, he rose and crossed to the window. The city lay muffled in white, silent and strange. Snow transformed everything, made the familiar new. If only people could be remade so easily. But they couldn't, and he wouldn't insult her again by pretending otherwise. He returned to his desk and pulled out fresh paper. His hand hovered over it, then set the pen down. Words were too easy. She'd heard enough of his promises, his plans, his certainty. The only apology worth making would be made through action, through silence and restraint, and the painful, necessary work of learning to let go. He gathered the documents methodically. The lease he couldn't break, he was bound to that year-long contract, would pay for an empty house as penance for his presumption. But everything else could be undone. He drafted letters by candlelight to his solicitor, canceling the trust arrangements, to the staff agency, withdrawing all applications, To the furniture merchants, ceasing pending deliveries. Each letter felt like prying loose a nail he'd driven too deep, but he wrote them all, sealed them, stacked them for morning post. The vicar's letter sat separate. That required a personal visit. When the sky began to pale toward dawn, Gabriel hadn't slept, but his mind was clearer than it had been in days. He knew what he had to do. He would undo what he could. And then, hardest of all, he would do nothing. He would not write, would not call, would not send gifts or explanations or pleas. He would give her the one thing he'd failed to give before, the freedom to choose without his interference. If she ever forgave him, she would have to come to that conclusion herself, on her own terms, in her own time, and he would wait, however long it took. The thought of it opened a hollow beneath his ribs, but for the first time since she'd sent him away, he felt something close to peace. Not happiness, he'd forfeited any right to that, but purpose, direction. He would learn to love her the way she deserved, freely, without possession, without the need to control. Even if it meant loving her from a distance. Even if it meant losing her entirely. The days passed in the gray rhythm of survival. Meg woke, dressed, tended to the children. She swept floors and mended hems and read stories by the fire. She did not think about Gabriel Sterling except in every quiet moment between tasks. The children asked about him daily. Did we do something wrong? Theo wanted to know. Lottie announced she missed the tall man who let her button his buttons. He was nice, Meg agreed, her throat tight, but sometimes people's paths take them different directions. But he promised to play with my coach, Theo said, and that small, bewildered hurt made her want to weep. She carried that weight through the days, her children's disappointed hope, her own tangled grief and anger, the exhaustion of being right when being right brought no comfort at all. By the fourth day, she'd stopped watching for his carriage. But at night, lying in the dark, she let herself remember. His laugh when Lottie had climbed into his lap, the warmth of his kiss, the way he'd looked at her children as if they were precious. He had been kind. He had been genuine. He had also been catastrophically wrong. Both things were true, and she didn't know what to do with the space between them. By Saturday, she'd grown practical again. She wrote to the vicar offering to help with the charity pupils. She planned menus that would stretch their modest resources. She told herself that heartbreak was a luxury she couldn't afford. Tomorrow was Sunday, New Year's Day. A fresh start, the calendar said. She tried to believe it. Gabriel walked the city endlessly, through the park, through the streets, avoiding her road entirely. Mrs. Trent watched with worried eyes but said nothing. His mother sent a note asking if he was ill. He replied that he was perfectly well. Simon called on the third day and found him unshaven, staring at nothing. Have you spoken to her? No. Are you planning to? Gabriel met his friend's eyes. She asked me to leave, so I left. That's what one does when one has finally learned to listen. And if she never forgives you? The question landed like a fist. Gabriel looked away. Then I'll live with that. It's no more than I deserve. Simon leaned forward. What if she wants to forgive you? What if she's waiting for you to try again? Then she'll have to tell me so herself. Gabriel's voice was firm. I'm not assuming anything ever again. If she decides I'm worth the risk, she knows where to find me. Simon left shaking his head, but Gabriel felt no urge to change course. This was the only way forward. Silence, restraint, and the desperate hope that love, if it were real, would find a way. The house on Hanover Square sat empty, its windows dark. He'd walked past it once, late at night when no one would see. The furniture waited inside like abandoned promises. The pianoforte gathered dust. The nursery stood ready for children who would never come. He paid the lease each week, a tithe to his own stupidity. But some nights he let himself imagine Meg at that pianoforte, Theo running through those halls, Lottie in that garden making kingdoms from whatever she found. The images hurt more than the empty rooms. On Saturday evening, he stood in his study and made a decision. Tomorrow was Sunday, New Year's Day. He would go to church, not hers, but his own, across town. He would sit through the service and try to remember how to pray. And if that failed, he would simply keep walking, keep waiting, keep learning what it meant to love someone without needing to possess them. It wasn't hope exactly, but it was something close enough to live on. For now, that would have to be enough. Chapter 14. Sunday morning arrived cold and bright, the kind of winter light that made everything look scrubbed clean. Meg woke early and dressed with care. Not the gray wool of widowhood, but the blue. She told herself it was because the children deserved to see her in something cheerful on New Year's Day. She did not think about Gabriel Sterling as she pinned her hair. She thought about him constantly. At church, she settled into her usual pew near the back. Theo counted ceiling cracks. Lottie swung her legs until Meg stilled her with a gentle hand. The service began. Hymns, prayers, Reverend Baker climbing to the pulpit to speak of new beginnings and unwritten pages. Meg heard none of it. Her gaze kept drifting to the front of the church, to the place where banns were read. If he hadn't canceled them, her name would be spoken there this morning. Margaret Winslow and Gabriel Sterling, Earl of Wrentham. First reading of 3. The thought should have brought relief. Instead, her chest ached, because she realized, sitting there with winter light streaming through ancient glass, that she wanted to hear those banns, wanted her name joined with his, wanted everyone to know she'd chosen him, but chosen freely, asked, not arranged. The difference was everything, and also nothing. She loved him still. That was the simple, unbearable truth. Loved him enough to have said yes if he'd only thought to ask. She'd been right to send him away, but God, she wished he would come back and do it properly. "Mama," Theo whispered, "are you well?" She pressed her fingers to her eyes. "Yes, darling, just tired." When the service ended, she gathered her children and moved toward the door, already planning the long afternoon ahead. Mrs. Winslow, Reverend Baker, stood by the vestry, his expression kind. "Might I have a word?" Her stomach dropped, but she nodded. The children waited by the door while she followed the vicar inside. "Lord Wrentham came to see me," he said without preamble. "Friday morning. He canceled the banns before they could be read." The floor tilted. Meg gripped the back of a chair. "He was quite distressed," Reverend Baker continued gently. "Said he'd made a grave error in presumption. He also tried to return his donation. I convinced him we genuinely need the roof mended, but he wanted no appearance of manipulation." The vicar paused. "He asked me if you should ever inquire to tell you he's waiting, not expecting, just waiting." Meg couldn't speak, couldn't breathe. "I must ask you something," Reverend Baker said quietly, "and forgive the impertinence. Do you love him?" "Yes." The word came without thought, without hesitation. The vicar smiled. "Then perhaps you should tell him so." The walk home passed in a blur. At the house, she settled the children with bread and cheese, promising dinner later. Then she stood in the parlor, heart racing. He'd undone it all, and now he was waiting for permission, for her. She had to go to him. "Mama?" Theo appeared in the doorway. "Are you going somewhere?" She looked at her son. Clever, worried Theo. "I have an errand. Will you watch your sister?" "To see Lord Wrentham?" "Perhaps." "You should," Theo said solemnly. "He makes you smile." Out of the mouths of children, Meg wrapped her cloak around her shoulders and stepped into the cold. Snow had begun again, light flakes that caught in her hair and melted on her cheeks. The walk to Brook Street felt endless and far too short. Doubt crept in with every step. What if he wasn't home? What if he'd changed his mind? What if she was too late? But she kept walking. She was halfway there when she saw him, a tall figure in a dark coat, walking toward her through the falling snow. For a moment she thought she'd conjured him. Then he stopped, and she stopped, and the space between them filled with white silence. Gabriel. He looked thinner. Shadows beneath his eyes, hair damp with snow, like a man who'd been walking for hours with nowhere to go. "Meg," her name was barely a whisper. "I was coming to find you." Something shifted in his face, hope struggling against disbelief. "Why?" "I was in church this morning. The vicar told me you'd canceled everything." He took a step closer, cautious. "I couldn't let them stand, not without your permission. I know." Snow caught in her eyelashes. "But Gabriel, I was sitting there, and I realized something." He waited, barely breathing. "If you hadn't canceled them, they would have been read today. Our banns." Her voice cracked, and I found myself wishing I could hear them. His breath caught audibly. "I wanted to hear them," she said. "I wanted my name with yours, but I wanted it asked, not arranged. Do you understand?" "Yes." The word was fierce. "God, yes. Then ask me." She stepped closer. "Ask me now, properly." He closed the distance and took her hands. His fingers trembled. Margaret Winslow. Will you marry me? Why? She asked it gently. Why do you want to marry me? Because I love you. Because you taught me that devotion isn't possession. Because I want to spend the rest of my life asking questions and waiting for your answers. His grip tightened. Because I choose you, and I want you to choose me. Freely. Yes. The word came out fierce, joyful. Yes, Gabriel. He pulled her into his arms, and she went willingly, pressing her face against his coat. Cedar and cold air and the scent of him she'd been trying to forget. I love you, she whispered. May I kiss you? Even now, even holding her. She tilted her face up. Please. He kissed her there in the falling snow, gentle and reverent, a question asked and answered, a future begun properly. When they pulled apart, both were breathless, snow-dusted, smiling. Come with me, he said. There's something I need to show you. Hanover Square was hushed under its blanket of white. Gabriel led her to a modest townhouse with tall windows and a small garden behind iron railings. His hands shook as he unlocked the door. Inside, everything waited. The pianoforte in its sunny parlor, nursery furniture arranged just so, a breakfast room opening onto the garden, light everywhere, even on a gray winter day. Meg walked through slowly, seeing it with new eyes. Not a cage, but a question. Could you be happy here? In the nursery, she stopped. 3 beds, one for Theo, one for Lottie, one smaller. Waiting. She turned. Gabriel stood in the doorway watching. It's beautiful, she said quietly, but it's not yours, not unless you choose it. He stepped closer. We can leave it empty, find another, build something together from nothing. I don't care where we live as long as you choose it. She took his hands. We'll fill it together. Every room, every choice, our way. Relief flooded his face. Yes, together. But not today, she smiled. Today, just show me what you imagined. They walked through again and he told her. The pianoforte because she'd played once. The nursery arranged so the children wouldn't be lonely. The garden for Lottie's kingdoms. She stopped him with a kiss. You didn't build this to control me. You built it because you love me. The mistake wasn't the house. It was not asking if I wanted it. I'm asking now. And I'm answering. Yes. They stood in the empty parlor while snow fell outside, and Meg felt something settle into place. Partnership, trust, love without possession. The vicar, she said. We should tell him to read the banns after all. Gabriel's smile was incandescent. Are you certain? Completely. Next Sunday. Let everyone hear. 3 weeks before we can marry. Can you bear it? I've waited 4 years, she said. I can wait 3 more weeks. Besides, you'll be courting me properly, asking permission for everything. He laughed. I'll ask what you had for breakfast. I'll ask if I may carry your parcels. Don't be ridiculous. She kissed him to stop the words, and when they pulled apart, both were smiling. Come, he said. Let me walk you home. I need to ask your children's permission to court their mother. They'll say yes. They've been asking after you every day. He closed his eyes briefly. Then I'll ask them properly, too. They locked the house and walked back through snow-brightened streets, hand in hand. Tomorrow they would tell the vicar. Next Sunday, the first banns would be read. In 3 weeks, they would marry. But today, this perfect, impossible, hard-won today was theirs. And it had started with a question, freely asked and freely answered, just as it should be. Epilogue, 1 year later, Wrentham Park, December 1819. Gabriel Sterling had spent 29 Christmases at Wrentham Park, dreading every moment. The 30th, he could not imagine being anywhere else. Snow dusted the fields beyond the windows, and from somewhere deep in the house came a shriek. Lottie, presumably, though it could have been one of his nieces. The sound was followed by thundering footsteps, a bark from the hound, and his mother's laughter echoing through the hall. He stood in the doorway of the great room and took it all in. The massive tree listing slightly to one side, where Theo had insisted on hanging one more ornament, ribbons trailing over furniture, his sister Caroline attempting to organize parlor games while children darted past her like schools of fish. The fire roaring, the noise immense. It was chaos, glorious, ridiculous, inescapable chaos, and he loved every moment of it. There you are. Meg appeared at his elbow, cheeks flushed from laughter or warmth or both. She wore deep green silk, his gift, chosen because it brought out the color of her eyes, and her hand came to rest absently on the swell beneath her waist. 4 months along, the physician said. Due in May. I was merely observing, Gabriel said, slipping his arm around her, making certain no one sets the curtains alight. Liar, you were gloating. Perhaps a little. He pressed a kiss to her temple. Is that allowed? I'll permit it. She leaned into him, fitting against his side as naturally as breathing. Your mother wants Theo to sing after dinner. She's been telling everyone about his solo at the Abbey. Gabriel felt the familiar swell of pride. Theo's voice had only grown more remarkable with training. The boy had started calling him father in March, hesitant at first, then with growing certainty. Gabriel had never felt more honored by any title. The choirmaster sent reports that used words like extraordinary and once in a generation. But what pleased Gabriel most was the light in the boy's eyes when he sang, pure joy, untainted by obligation. He'll pretend to be reluctant, Gabriel predicted, and then sing 3 encores. Naturally, he smiled. Where is he now? Helping your nephew build a fort in the library, or possibly demolishing it. The reports were unclear. A crash sounded from that direction, followed by boyish laughter. Gabriel didn't even flinch. Should we intervene? Absolutely not. Meg's eyes sparkled. Let them have their chaos. We've earned ours. Before he could respond, Lottie burst into the room, her doll clutched in one hand and a ribbon trailing from her hair. She made directly for Gabriel and wrapped herself around his legs. Papa, come see. I made the tree a crown. Papa. The word still caught him sometimes. This small person who'd claimed him as her own with the serene certainty of the very young. She'd started calling him that 3 months after the wedding, as if there had never been any question. He bent and scooped her up. A crown? Is it a Christmas tree or a queen? Both. She kissed his cheek with sticky enthusiasm. Gingerbread, he guessed, and wriggled to be set down. You have to see. She dragged him toward the tree, chattering the entire way about ribbon placement and whether trees could wear jewelry. Meg followed, her hand finding his free one, and they stood together looking at Lottie's creation. A lopsided circle of gold ribbon perched atop the highest branch. It's magnificent, Gabriel said solemnly. I knew you'd like it. Lottie beamed at him, then spotted her grandmother across the room and was off again, a small whirlwind of energy and certainty. Meg squeezed his hand. You're very good at this. At what? Being a father. The words settled warm in his chest. A year ago, he'd been a man who thought love could be controlled, managed, built like a house from careful plans. Now he was a man who let a 4-year-old put crowns on Christmas trees and considered it a triumph. I had excellent teachers, he said quietly. A boy who showed me that joy doesn't need permission. A little girl who taught me that love is given freely or not at all. And a woman who had the courage to send me away until I learned the difference. Meg's eyes grew bright. That woman sounds formidable. Terrifying, Gabriel agreed. I'm very fortunate she took pity on me. Pity had nothing to do with it. She rose on her toes and kissed him, quick and sweet and tasting of the mulled wine someone had pressed into her hand earlier. I chose you, freely, and I'd choose you again. Even with all this? He gestured at the chaos surrounding them, his mother directing footmen, his sisters arguing cheerfully about pudding, children racing through halls that had once echoed with his lonely footsteps. Especially with all this. Meg's hand moved to his chest, over his heart. This is what you were missing, Gabriel. Not quiet, not control. This, belonging. She was right. He'd spent years avoiding Christmas, but he'd been avoiding the wrong thing. It wasn't the chaos he'd hated. It was the emptiness of going through it alone. Now he belonged. Come, Meg said, tugging his hand. Your mother wants us in the music room. Theo's going to sing and she's convinced herself you'll accompany him on the pianoforte. I don't play. You do now. I've been teaching you, remember? He did remember. Sunday afternoons at the house in Hanover Square, Meg patient at the keys while he fumbled through scales like a schoolboy, the children laughing at his mistakes, the way she'd kiss him when he finally managed a phrase without error. They'd filled that house together just as she'd insisted, chosen every detail, made every decision as partners. It was theirs in a way nothing had ever been his alone. I'm terrible at it, he warned. You're adequate, which is all Theo needs, someone to keep time while he shows off. She smiled. Besides, I like watching you try. You get this little furrow right here. She touched the spot between his brows. When you're concentrating, it's very endearing. I'm not endearing. I'm an Earl. You're both. Now come along before your mother sends a search party. They made their way to the music room, hand in hand, while around them the house rang with laughter and music, and the particular warmth of people who loved each other gathered close. Theo was already there, looking nervous and excited in equal measure. Gabriel's mother sat in the front row, dabbing at her eyes before anything had even begun. She'd wept at the wedding too, not from grief, but from joy that her son had finally found someone who made him human again. Gabriel took his place at the pianoforte, the same instrument he'd once played alone in an empty house, trying to remember what joy felt like. Meg settled beside him on the bench, her shoulder warm against his. "Ready?" she murmured. He looked at Theo, who grinned at him with the absolute confidence of a boy who knew he was loved. At his mother, who'd never stopped hoping he'd find happiness. At his sisters, his nieces and nephews, this whole impossible family he'd once fled from and now couldn't imagine living without. And at Meg, his wife, his partner, the woman who'd taught him that the only thing worth controlling was his own fear of letting go. "Ready," he said. Theo began to sing. The sound filled the room, pure and clear and achingly beautiful. Gabriel's fingers found the keys, stumbling only a little, and Meg's hand covered his briefly in encouragement. The music swelled. His mother wept. Lottie hummed along tunelessly from her perch on the floor. And Gabriel Sterling, who had once believed Christmas was something to be avoided, felt his throat tighten with a gratitude so profound it was almost painful. This noise, this chaos, this overwhelming abundance of love and laughter and people who needed him and let themselves be needed in return. This was what he'd been missing all along. When the final note faded, the room erupted in applause. Theo bowed, flushed with pleasure. Meg leaned her head on Gabriel's shoulder. The baby moved beneath her hand, a small flutter of life, a promise of more chaos to come. "Merry Christmas, my love," she whispered. Gabriel turned his head and kissed her hair, breathing in the scent of her, lavender and happiness and home. "Merry Christmas," he whispered back, and meant it more than he'd ever meant anything in his life. We hope you have enjoyed this presentation of The Winter He Couldn't Forget, written by Violet Sinclair, narrated by Isadora Blythe.